Well, the government does recognise that increases in the cost of living are having a significant impact on the lower paid, and it's within that context and after careful consideration that we chose to accept in full the review body's recommendations to award the consolidated increase, as I mentioned in my main answer. We want to ensure that there is support for our officers who play a vital role in this country.
Boris Johnson.
Given that entry pay rates have already, on the streets of London alone, attracted another 4,734 more police officers to join the Metropolitan Police, and given how vitally important it is to continue to provide the right place for those new recruits to be properly trained, Mr. Speaker, will she agree with me that Uxbridge remains the most sensible place in Hillingdon to have a police station? And will she join me in passing that view to the present Mayor of London?
Home Secretary.
Well, my right friend speaks a lot of sense as usual, and he is absolutely right, and he has a huge amount of which to be proud when it comes to increasing the numbers of police officers on the front line fighting crime and standing up for victims, something that Labour has opposed at every opportunity. And may I make a humble request of my right friend? May he give up some of his precious time to advise the current Mayor of London, who is wholly failing on fighting crime, having seen a 9% increase in crime in London. He really could take some advice from his predecessor.
Sarah Jones, Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New statistics published today reveal that the mini-budget cost even more than we first thought, a staggering £30 billion. This comes on top of 12 years of austerity, which has seen real terms pay cut for police and staff, thousands of jobs lost and prosecutions plummeted. The Home Secretary was in the Cabinet and the Policing Minister was number 2 in the Treasury at the time of the mini-budget. Will they both now apologise to our police for the damage they have done?
Home Secretary.
The government is clear that policing must have a modern pay structure that recognises and rewards skills and competence rather than time served. And it's in line with that approach that chief constables have the discretion to pay an officer a starting salary of between £23,556 and £26,682, depending on qualifications and experience. The settlement is fair. We want our police officers to be empowered and strong in the fight against crime.
Ellen Hayes.
Question number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is determined to reduce neighbourhood crime, and I'm pleased to report to the House that since 2019, neighbourhood crime has reduced by around about 20%. Of course, it's up to chief constables to decide on their level of PCSO officers that they may choose to recruit, but the House will be aware we're in the process of hiring an extra 20,000 police officers, after which we will have a record number of uniformed officers serving.
Ellen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Police community support officers have a vital role to play in tackling neighbourhood crime and also in building trust and confidence in policing at community level, because they are often the most visible officers to our communities. Can the Minister therefore confirm how many fewer officers assigned to neighbourhood roles there are in England and Wales today than there were in 2010, and how long he expects it to take until police officer and staff numbers in neighbourhood roles reach that same number again?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm, as I said a moment ago, that neighbourhood crime is about 20% lower than it was in 2019. I can confirm that after these 20,000 officers have been recruited in April next year, we will have a record number of uniformed officers serving in this country. And I can confirm that in the Metropolitan Police area, which includes her constituency and mine and the Shadow Police Ministers, we are already at a record number of uniformed officers.
Teresa Villiers.
PCSOs play a vital role in London's ward safer neighbourhood teams. And these perform a vital function. Will the Minister ask the Mayor of London why he's starving boroughs like Barnet of the officers needed to make up these SNT teams to tackle crime and antisocial behaviour?
Well, I think my honourable friend asks a very good question, because as I said Because, as I said already, the Metropolitan Police already has more uniformed officers than it has ever had at any point in its history. And in the current financial year, they've had a funding increase of £170 million compared to last year. So I think my honourable friend asks a very reasonable question.
Very good.
The Borough of Brent has seen 320 hours of Safer Neighbourhood Teams police time abstracted in the past 3 months. So these figures are not actually made public routinely, and it's important for communities to be able to access that information because they need to know that their Safer Neighbourhood Teams are there acting for them. So will the Home Secretary undertake to publish the abstraction figures as a matter of routine?
Minister.
Well, operational matters such as those the honourable gentleman mentions are obviously a matter for the police, but I do share his concern about the level of abstractions owing to the unjustified Just Stop Oil protests in the month of October and early November. I can say that about 11,000 Metropolitan Police officer shifts have been lost as a result of having to police these outrageous and unnecessary protests. That is a matter of concern, and that is why it's so important that we see an end to these protests as quickly as possible.
Vicky Ford.
Mr. Speaker, I usually get very positive feedback about Chelmsford pubs, clubs and nightclubs, but in recent weeks there's been a flurry of emails and comments on social media about suspected spiking incidents at one establishment. I've been in touch with our excellent city centre policing team, part of the hundreds more police we have in Essex in the past 5 years. But can my right honourable friend join me in encouraging all those who think they may have been victims of spiking to come forward and report these incidents to the police so that the perpetrators can be caught and held to account?
Minister.
Well, I think my honourable friend is making an extremely important point. I certainly can join her in calling on victims to report these actually very serious and damaging offences as quickly as possible. And of course, I would add that the government is committed to producing a report on the prevalence and nature of spiking and the action needed to be taken to tackle it by April of next year.
Shadow Minister Usher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Neighbourhood policing and PCSOs should be at the heart of communities, providing proactive policing to keep communities safe. Yet, after cutting thousands of neighbourhood police officers from our streets, the Tories have also cut 8,000 PCSOs. Labour have made a commitment to hire thousands more PCSOs as part of a fully funded neighbourhood policing programme. Will the Minister match that commitment, or are there further cuts coming after Thursday's budget?
Well, I'm sure, as the honourable lady knows, the total amount of funding going into policing this year is £16.9 billion, a £1.1 billion increase compared to last year. And as I've said once or twice before, but I'll say it again, come April of next year, when those 20,000 extra officers are hired, we will have a record number of uniformed officers serving on our streets.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Question 6, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Office now publishes an extensive range of data in respect of no recourse to public funds, change of condition applications, including data on age, gender and nationality. We're open to other avenues to obtain further NRPF-related data, and plans for doing so have been set out in published correspondence with the UK Statistics Authority.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Mr. Speaker, at the moment, the Home Office doesn't know how many people it gives leave to remain to with no recourse to public funds attached. For months, ministers and officials in the department have been saying that a new IT system is about to be introduced, giving us this information. The chair of the UK Statistics Authority, who the minister mentioned, told me in a letter in February that this new system would be operational sometime this year rather than last year, as previously announced. When will the department now take back control and switch on their new system so they can provide this completely basic information?
Minister.
Well, I understand my right honourable friend's long-standing interest in this issue, and we have made clear on a number of occasions that we also want to deepen and enrich the level of data that's available. We have been speaking with our stakeholders to see what further steps we might be able to take, and I'm happy to keep the Right Honourable Gentleman informed.
Dr. Lucan.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are clear that the asylum system needs to do better. Cases need to be processed more quickly. The Asylum Transformation Programme aims to bring the system back into balance and to modernise it, and it is focused on increasing productivity by streamlining and digitising processes to speed up decision-making to increase efficiency and output.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a hotel in Earl Shilton that's twice been identified to try and help deal with the backlog, but failed due to health and safety concerns, particularly around fire. So I was surprised when my constituents wrote to me saying they'd seen asylum seekers in this hotel. I contacted the Borough Council, the County Council and the police, none of which knew anything about it. So I checked social media to see that the story was corroborated, and it was true. I contacted the Home Office and it took 72 hours to find out, to it be confirmed that they'd been placed there. This is completely unacceptable. What is she doing to make sure this doesn't happen to other constituencies? And will she meet with me to discuss the situation in Earl Shilton so that communication can be better?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising this issue. We have had unprecedented pressure on the system recently, and that has been challenging for operational partners to respond to. We have a statutory duty to provide destitute asylum seekers with accommodation. We do inform local partners of our actions, but due to the incredible pressure on the system recently, despite our ambitions to do that expeditiously, sometimes, yes, we have fallen short. I understand direct communication has been sent to my honourable friend, but we want to improve our engagement to ensure that there is much better understanding and support from local communities affected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We now know of at least 4 sexual assaults of children in these hotels, children who've been there left for months because of the backlog. In a meeting last week with MPs, her officials committed to providing details of the safeguarding requirements the private contractors have if the ministers gave them permission. If the Home Secretary is so confident that she's doing everything she can to provide the duty of care to these vulnerable children, will she give permission and will she publish?
Home Secretary.
Well, I've been very straight about the fact that our asylum system does need improvement. Together with the Immigration Minister, we are working intensively at improving our processes and the duties and how they are discharged to those in our care, whether they are children or adults or other vulnerable people. There has been unprecedented pressure on the system. We are working at pace and have done so for several months now to procure alternative accommodation. We are working intensively and we hope to get everybody's support in that effort.
Sir Roger Gale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearing the asylum backlog, the processing backlog, is one of the keys to solving the whole asylum problem. And we need to get on with it and make sure that it's done as fast as possible. The other key is controlling, of course, the source of the problem. Yeah. I'm pleased to learn of the measure signed by my right honourable friend in Paris this morning. It is a modest step towards solving a much greater problem. Would my right honourable friend agree that rather than populist policies which may grab headlines, the only way to solve this problem will be through painstaking hard work of the kind that my right honourable friend the Prime Minister and Monsieur Macron have instigated?
Home Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for all of his support and input into this very challenging issue, and I was very pleased to have visited Manston with him a few weeks ago. He's absolutely right. There is no single solution to this problem, and international cooperation is a vital part of the solution. That's why I'm very grateful to French partners for their effective work to date, but also for their support for this positive step future in the New Deal that I signed this morning with my opposite number in France, which will greater deepen our cooperation and further our response to illegal migration on the Channel.
Ruth Gabry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Hounslow, there are over 3,500 asylum seekers waiting for determination on their application in, at the last count, 12 interim or contingency hotels, waiting not weeks, not months, but even years. They exist in accommodation and eating food that is not fit for animals, and Clear Spring Ready Homes and a network of unaccountable subcontractors are skimming off vast profits, ripping off both the accommodation providers and the vulnerable asylum seekers, and of course the taxpayer. As the Home Secretary admits the Home Office has a challenge here, why won't she contract with local authorities who have expertise in procuring accommodation and will ensure the basic standards that the member for Bosworth is concerned about, and ensure safeguarding as well?
Order. Can I just say, it's a very important point, but I have to get other members in. You can't do speech, it's going to be short questions. I think the Home Secretary's got the drift of that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, there are many plans afoot to try and improve the processing of asylum claims, and one of those relates to accommodation and procuring alternative accommodation for those seeking asylum. We need to reduce our reliance on hotels. We need to improve our productivity within the asylum processing system. We need to ensure that people stop making the journey in the first place. There are huge levels of work ongoing. I would really encourage her to support those plans and our work.
Shall the Minister, Stephen Kinnock?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Nationality and Borders Act establishes a new category of asylum seekers whom the government claims are not permitted to claim asylum in Britain and who should therefore be removed. But because they have failed to agree a returns agreement with France, and because the Rwanda policy is completely unworkable, 16,000 people in this category have been stuck in limbo, waiting an additional 6 months for a decision at huge cost to the British taxpayer. And of those 16,000 who are in limbo, only 21 have been returned since the Act came into force. Do ministers therefore accept that their own legislation is adding further delays, cost, chaos and confusion to an already broken system, whilst doing next to nothing to remove failed asylum seekers who have no right to be here?
Mr. Speaker, I find it staggering, frankly, that Labour seem to love complaining about the system, but when we introduced laws to fix it, what did they do? They oppose every step of the way. We wanted to make it easier to deport foreign national offenders. Labour voted against it. We wanted to fix our asylum system. Labour voted against it. We secured a groundbreaking agreement with Rwanda. Labour would scrap it. Mr. Speaker, Labour are very, very, very good at complaining. They have absolutely no solution at all.
Imran Hussain.
Number 8, sir.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our immigration system allows people from across the globe to come to the United Kingdom to visit and join family here. Over 2 million entry clearance visas were issued in the year ending June 2022. But it's also right to ensure that visitors intend to leave at the end of their stay, and those coming to join family can be supported by their family and not by the British taxpayer.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the Home Office's own figures of the total accepted and rejected visitor visa applications, just under 20% ended up as rejected. Yet when it comes to those of Pakistani and Bangladeshi nationality, these figures suddenly, dramatically and unexplainably rise to 30%. So does the Minister really expect us to believe that there is no racial or religious bias at the Home Office?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman is completely wrong, and that is a baseless slur on my officials at the Home Office. All visa applications are based on objective criteria, and I would add that there were in fact 303,000 visas and permits granted for family members in the year ending June 2022, which is 61% more than in 2019. So the Home Office is granting record numbers of these visas, and we do so in an entirely objective fashion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Mary Samuels, is the legal guardian to her niece, Faith, who is currently in Sierra Leone. Mary has submitted a visa application for Faith as a non-British child of a parent who has permission to be in the UK. But the lack of presence of any parents or guardians for faith in Sierra Leone is putting her at serious and substantial risk. And while I'm grateful for the ongoing conversations that we've had with the Home Office, this has now been ongoing since July 2021. I know the Minister can't comment on the case on the floor of the House, but will he commit to personally reviewing this case and to meet with me to discuss how we can make sure this intolerable situation for Mary and Faith can be concluded as quickly as possible?
Well, I know my honourable friend has been following assiduously this exceptional case. I can say that the application is in its final stages of consideration, and the applicant will be notified of the outcome as soon as a decision has been made. Of course, I'd be happy to meet with my honourable friend if that would be helpful.
Shadow Minister Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In contrast to family, spouse and visitor visas, until February of this year, golden visas were available to all those who could afford them, some of the world's super rich with next to no background checks. Spotlight on Corruption found that of all the golden visas issued, around half, so that's over 6,000, have been reviewed for possible national security risks. Wow. When he was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, the Security Minister called for the 2018 review into golden visas to be published. So can the government confirm when will we finally see that review?
Well, my right honourable friend, the Security Minister, has been clear that we will publish that report as soon as possible, and it will be published at the earliest available opportunity. But I would say that this was the government that brought an end to golden visas, and this is the government that has led the world in terms of its economic sanctions in support of the people of Ukraine.
Bob Blackman.
Question number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to group this question with questions 13 and 19. The government has taken a dual approach to tackling serious violence, combining tough enforcements with programmes steering people away from crime. Since 2019, we've invested £170 million in the areas most affected by violence to boost the police response, but have also invested a further £170 million developing violence reduction units to tackle the root causes of violent crime. These programmes together have been assessed as preventing 49,000 violent offences in their first 2 years.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his answer. Harrow is generally speaking a safe borough in which to live, but we've seen an 18% increase this year in knife crime. Last month there were 41 major incidents, and only last week there was a major incident where 3 people were stabbed and put into hospital. So does my honourable friend agree with me that what is needed is not just extra police officers, but apprehending people that carry knives, punishing them by taking them to court and imprisoning them so they can't cause damage to other people?
Minister.
Yes, I would agree with my honourable friend that a robust police response is essential, including robust use by the courts of the 2 strikes rules, requiring a mandatory prison sentence on the second conviction for possessing a bladed article. Those are very important, and I'm happy with him to have a look at how that is working if it needs to be pushed a bit further. I'm sorry to hear about the knife crime statistics in Harrow. Nationwide, knife crime or knife-enabled crime is down about 9% compared to pre-pandemic levels. But if the honourable gentleman feels there is more that needs to be done in his area, I'd be happy to discuss that with him.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And following on from that, the 2-strike strategy is not something we've done in Milton Keynes. In Milton Keynes, if you are caught with a knife, you will spend time behind bars. And the Home Secretary was hearing about that, about Operation Deter. But along with the right legislation and the right policing strategies like OpDeter, we also need to work with local communities. So will my right honourable friend join with me in welcoming the Knife Angel to Milton Keynes so that we can work with communities to raise awareness of the consequences of knife crime on our communities?
Minister.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with my honourable friend. Knife Angels and organisations like them do fantastic work. I strongly commend them, and it's exactly that kind of initiative that some of the funding streams I mentioned earlier are designed to support.
Secretary answers 12. You want to come?
Alex Cunningham.
Much, Mr. Speaker. A couple of weeks ago, I watched a film from a security camera in Stockton showing 2 men. One used a chainsaw to cut through the door of a house, whilst another set about smashing all the windows in a bid to get to the resident. Who knows what would have happened if they'd got in? It's another example of terrifying attacks by dangerous organised criminals determined to silence our communities as they fight to control their illegal drug businesses on Teesside. The government love to spin a story about police recruitment, but will Cleveland Police ever get back the hundreds of police officers that have been cut since 2010 and the resources needed to protect our communities and catch these criminals?
Well, I certainly agree with the member for Stockton North that the kind of crime he describes is absolutely despicable, and those who commit it should be pursued, prosecuted and imprisoned. I met with the excellent Police and Crime Commissioner for Cleveland, Steve Turner, just a short time ago, and with the Chief Constable, Mark Webster, in fact, just a week ago. He mentions resources. Of course, Cleveland this year is receiving an extra £7.8 million compared to last year, and they've been allocated 239 extra officers as part of the Police Uplift programme, of whom 197 are already in post.
Ben.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. In September, I asked the then Home Office Minister why it is still legal for anyone aged 18 and over to walk into a shop and buy a machete. I was told, because the incidence of the use of machetes on our streets is increasing, I was told that the Serious Weapons Review is looking at it. Could the Minister tell us when that will be concluded and when the government will act to ban the sale of machetes in this country?
Minister.
Well, I thank the right gentleman for his question. I've got a lot of sympathy for the point he's making. And in the 2 or 3 weeks since I've been in this position, I've met Deputy Assistant Commissioner McNulty, who has particular expertise in this area and in fact is the NPCC lead on this topic. He's made a number of very interesting proposals in this area that are consistent with what the Honourable Gentleman has just suggested. I am currently studying those very carefully and very sympathetically, and hope to have more to say on this topic in the near future.
Question 10, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
There are currently no material delays in the physical production or delivery of biometric residence permits. We aim to deliver a BRP within 7 working days of the immigration decision. All BRPs are currently being produced within 48 hours of receipt of a production request at the secure printing facility. Our secure delivery partner, FedEx, is attempting to deliver 99% of BRPs within 48 hours of their production and is successfully delivering nearly 80% of them first time.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for those statistics, which appear to be somewhat at odds with the experience of my constituents. Oksana Vakiliuk, a refugee from Ukraine, has been waiting since the 1st of May for her BRP. Adnam Hamid was granted a Tier 2 visa, also in May, still waiting for his BRP last month. And Mohammed Poswell waiting since July for his wife to receive the spousal visa stamp in her passport. I really appreciate the work that my right honourable friend is doing in this respect, but the challenge is that these individuals could be working in our economy. They could be contributing to the skill shortages that we have, and indeed they could be paying tax. Can I ask if he will meet me to go through these and indeed other cases to help understand what's causing the delays, which may be specific to my region?
Yes.
I'd be very happy to meet with my right honourable friend. As I said in answer to her initial question, the data suggests that the vast majority of customers are receiving their BRPs within 7 days and the system is working in an acceptable fashion. But if cases are falling through the cracks, it's of course right that we aim to fix that, and I'd be pleased to meet with her.
Kevin Brennan.
Biometrics obviously are important, but also in relation to spousal visas, which the Honourable Member also mentioned, as per his colleague, I have a constituent whose wife is an Afghani citizen but stuck in Iran, and as we know, Afghani refugees are not being treated well in Iran, but the Home Office, in replies to me, are saying that they won't particularly expedite this case. I wonder if he'd afford me the same courtesy he did to his colleague and look into the case I've mentioned if I write to him after this session.
Minister.
I'd be very happy to do so.
Shot.
Question 11, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Drug controls seek to strike a balance between preventing criminality on the one hand and allowing access for legitimate use such as medicines development on the other. The government is guided in its decisions by the Advisory Council on the misuse of drugs. There's a well-established process for taking these decisions, and of course we follow the expert advice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Psilocybin should never have been designated a Schedule 1 substance, but this position by the Home Office has become even more untenable following publication of the largest multi-site Phase 2B trial of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression this month. The study found rapid and enduring reductions in depression symptoms at a 25 milligram dose, but further very promising research in the UK is being severely hindered by psilocybin's Schedule 1 status and prohibitive costs associated to our academic researchers. Will the Home Secretary therefore finally commit to rescheduling psilocybin and related compounds to Schedule 2 to allow more research into mental health treatment paradigms that could see a happier, healthier and more productive country and a growth boon for our science, innovation and pharmacology sectors?
Yes. Minister.
Yes, so the drug that the Honourable Lady refers to is an MDMA-based medicine. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs is currently considering the barriers to legitimate research which are posed by controlled drugs. And once we've had their advice on the topic, including the implications for psychedelic drugs such as MDMA and psilocybin, we will obviously take an appropriate decision in relation to research. In relation to more widespread availability, obviously we will follow decisions made by the MHRA and NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, before taking decisions about more widespread availability.
Vital Fabrica.
Question 12, sir.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and I are committed to reducing dangerous illegal migration into the UK. And that's why I was in Paris today with my French counterpart, Gérald Darmanin, to have agreed a new joint strategy and operational plan. It will drive forward our next phase of cooperation and make this route unviable eventually.
Vital Fabrica.
Well, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on her agreement in Paris today? But my right honourable friend has said herself that this can be no silver bullet. Indeed, there is no silver bullet, as she puts it. Given there are so many hundreds of miles of French coastline to be policed, will this agreement be a game changer?
Home Secretary.
Well, as my honourable friend says, on its own, this agreement will not fix the problem. It's important that everyone is clear about that. But I'm very proud of the cooperation that the UK and France have led over the recent years. I do think this deal represents a step change and a big step forward in our joint challenge. For the first time, under this new integrated approach, UK officers will join law enforcement colleagues in France as embedded observers to share real-time information relating to small boats. The deal will include significant investment in intelligence capability and information sharing that all agencies will use, including the National Crime Agency and Europol. I believe it's a big step forward, and I encourage everyone here to get behind it.
Dame Diana Johnson, Chair of the Select Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Affairs Select Committee report that we published in the summer on small boat crossings made a series of recommendations, one of which was more engagement with the French, so we very much welcome the announcement this morning. Of course, it's the fifth announcement on arrangements with the French in 4 years, and there isn't a single one thing that's going to solve this problem, and that's why we made a series of recommendations, including securing an agreement with the EU on the return of failed asylum seekers and piloting the provision of initial UK asylum applications facilities within French reception centres, so individuals wanting to seek asylum in the UK could do so without having to get into those awful dinghies and make that treacherous crossing across the channel. So will the Home Secretary look again at the whole suite of recommendations that the Select Committee made after 2 years looking at this subject?
Home Sec.
Well, I have read with interest the report from the Select Committee, and it makes several very, very important points about greater collaboration and deeper cooperation with our friends in France. Last year, our joint efforts saw more than 23,000 dangerous and unnecessary crossings being prevented, and to date, this year, over 30,000 crossing attempts have been stopped by the French. Joint working has also resulted in the dismantling of 55 organised crime groups and secured over 500 arrests since its inception in 2020. That operational collaboration is an absolutely integral feature of solving this common challenge.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. Regrettably, the modest French agreement falls short of what is needed to address the scale, the impact and the urgency of the Channel crossings. We don't need more observation, we need action taken on the French side. For even today, as the ink was drying on this new deal, small boats crept through the sea mist and one even landed on a beach in a residential coastal village in my constituency. Will my right honourable friend meet with me and Kent leaders to discuss the very dreadful impact on local services that they have described in a letter to her 2 weeks ago as at breaking point?
Home Secretary.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for all of her work on this issue for several years. I mean, as I said, I'm not going to overplay this agreement. It's a very important step forward. I think it provides a very good platform from which deeper collaboration can be secured, but it does represent progress. For the first time, as I say, UK officers will be on the ground in France, working hand in hand with their French counterparts. They will be working side by side in the command HQ. They will be working with intelligence and surveillance material together. They will be partners in a very material sense in the fight against this challenge. Is it going to solve the problem? On its own, it won't. But I do encourage everybody to support the deal that we've secured.
Can I just suggest that actually the Home Secretary might not like it, but I just might give you some positive advice. When you're answering a question, you're meant to look through the chair. That's all I would say. Diana.
The Home Secretary insists that this agreement announced today represents a step forward. But is she able to tell the House whether this agreement will actually mean fewer small boats crossing the Channel?
Home Secretary.
Well, a large win from the agreement is that there will be more French gendarmes patrolling the French beaches. There's a 40% uplift to the actual number of personnel that the French are deploying. That must be a success, and I encourage her to welcome it.
Yeah. Come to Shadow Home Secretary Rebecca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is astonishing the Home Secretary hasn't done an oral statement on this, given the number of people who want to ask questions. She is preventing full scrutiny on this deal. Could it be because her written statement admits that there have only been 140 smuggling-related convictions across all of Britain and France in 35 months? Can she confirm that this means there have been, on average, just 4 convictions a month for these dangerous crimes, even though last month alone, nearly 7,000 people arrived in the UK as a result of organised criminals profiting from putting lives at risk? Why is the government's action against criminal smuggler gangs so pitifully weak?
Home Secretary.
Why is the government's action so pitifully? Mr. Speaker, we introduced legislation, an extensive bill designed specifically to deal with the problem that's occurring on our shores. And at every occasion, what did Labour do? They voted against it. If they were really serious about solving this problem, they would be supporting our proposals, not carping from the sidelines.
Yvette Cooper.
But that's a totally nonsense answer. She obviously isn't aware that former chief constables have warned that her Nationalities and Borders Bill makes it harder to prosecute people traffickers, and that in fact it is adding 6-month delays to the asylum system and pushing up the costs. Now, patrols and intelligence sharing are welcome, but long overdue. So will she match Labour's funded policy for a major expansion of additional specialist officers in the National Crime Agency, part of a proper plan to work with other countries to investigate and crack down on these gangs, or is she actually preparing for cuts in policing and security operations on Thursday because her party's disastrous management of the economy has let everyone down?
Mr. Speaker, of course we need to go further and faster in the fight against illegal migration, and I am very disappointed and very concerned by the unprecedented numbers of people arriving here illegally. We are taking steps to fix it. But the reality is that, as I said, this year alone, over 30,000 attempts have been prevented by the French. I've just come back today from securing a deal which is going to increase the number of French patrols on the French coastline, which is going to reinforce our collaboration and our intelligence work, which is going to strengthen our joint fight. And what does Labour do? They criticise. They criticise, Mr. Speaker, because the simple truth is this isn't about the French deal or our response. This is about their abject failure to speak on behalf of the British people. They don't care about illegal migration. They want an open doors migration policy, as they always have done.
We have SNP spokesperson Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we all welcome closer cooperation with the French, but I think the Home Secretary is absolutely right to temper our expectations, given we've seen previous deals signed in 2010, 2014, 15, 16, 18, 19, 20 and indeed 21. So can I ask, what discussions has she had with the French about safe legal routes for those with clear links to the United Kingdom, if necessary linked with an appropriate returns agreement? Surely she must see that only a deal including safe legal routes can make a significant and lasting impact.
Home Secretary.
Again, I'm not going to repeat myself, but I think this deal is a good step forward and a great platform from which to build deeper cooperation. And what I would gently say to the honourable gentleman is that it really would, he would have much more credibility in his question if actually Scotland stepped up further and took a better share of those coming here seeking refuge and asylum.
No to topicals. Richard Fuller.
Topical question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, if I may just make a short statement. The UK is working closely with France to reduce illegal small boats crossings over the Channel. And over the past year, these efforts have produced results. Today, I was in Paris with my French counterpart, Gérald Darmanin, to agree a more integrated and strengthened approach. It is aimed at making this lethally dangerous route unviable, with world-class law enforcement teams from both countries working even more closely together. It is a positive step forward, and for the first time, UK officers will join French law enforcement teams as embedded observers, sharing real-time information on the ground and in Command HQ. We will provide investment of up to £62 million this year, supporting cutting-edge surveillance technology, an expansion of the UK-France Joint Intelligence Cell, and more French officers patrolling the French coast. This is an international problem and requires an international solution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I raise a question about the Afghanistan Citizens Resettlement Scheme on behalf of a constituent whose father has played a prominent role in women's education, achieving recognition and awards from the United Nations. Now, the ACRS is a clearly structured scheme, but may I request a meeting with my right honourable friend to discuss the very special circumstances of my constituent's father?
Home Secretary.
Well, the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, which commenced on the 6th of January 2022, will see up to 20,000 people at risk resettled to the United Kingdom. And if my honourable friend would send me the details, I will ask the relevant teams to look at this case.
Stuart C. MacDonald, SNP spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, a commission established by Refugees for Justice and led by Helena Kennedy QC concluded that the 2020 stabbings and shooting at asylum accommodation in Glasgow's Park Inn could have been avoided, and they recommended important asylum reforms. Would the Home Secretary or the Immigration Minister agree to meet Baroness Kennedy, who I spoke to this morning, and Refugees for Justice to discuss this really important report?
Minister.
Well, I'd be very happy to meet with the Honourable Gentleman and indeed the Noble Baroness to discuss her report. We take safety at immigration removal centres extremely seriously, and if I can take this opportunity to pay tribute to those immigration enforcement officers and others who responded to the recent disturbance at Harmondsworth in London, their hard work was much appreciated by all of us in very difficult circumstances.
David Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the agreement that the Home Secretary has signed with the French government. It is a contribution in dealing with the asylum crisis and therefore allowing hundreds of hotels, including some in my constituency, to go back to doing their proper job. But does she also recognise that we need an asylum system that can process applications quickly? And if the figures remain at the 1.5 per week per decision maker that they are now, or even 4 a week, which the government's latest pilot has got, we are never going to see an end to the backlogs and delays. So can I urge the government to be more ambitious?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for his question and indeed his advice on this matter. We want to increase the productivity of our Home Office staff so that cases are not being decided to a tune of 1 per person per week, but to 4, 5 or 6, as indeed they were a few years ago. We've had a very positive pilot at our Leeds office, and we now intend to roll that out at pace across the country.
Bill Esterson.
8,000 fewer PCSOs, 6,000 fewer neighbourhood police officers. People can see for themselves there are fewer uniformed officers on our streets. No doubt the Home Secretary will deny yet again that the government has cut the police. So in the vain hope the public might be reassured by something this government says, I'll ask again, will she commit to matching Labour's plan to recruit 13,000 more neighbourhood police officers? No more smoke and mirrors, yes or no?
Well, there's no need for smoke or mirrors when the police budget this year is £1.1 billion higher than it was last year, and there's no need for smoke and mirrors when on completion of the Police Uplift programme in just a few months' time, there'll be more uniformed officers, police officers, on our streets than at any time in this country's history.
James Daly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask my right honourable friend what steps the government are taking to increase charging rates for offences of rape, serious sexual offending, harassment against women and girls?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his serious question. I know he works really hard in Bury North to talk about this issue. The government is committed to tackling violence against women and girls. We are taking action through the rape review, tackling violence against women and girls strategy and tackling domestic abuse to improve the police's response to these crimes. Charge volumes for rapes are up 8%. It's not enough. There's a lot more to do, and we're working hard with schemes like Operation Soteria in the hope that these good practices will make progress throughout the whole country.
Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Urgent cases marked urgent, not responded to within 2 months. Weekly phone calls with MPs' offices being cancelled at short notice. So can I ask when ministers are going to get a grip of the officials and make sure that members of this House are treated with respect so we can represent our constituents?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman and I have already spoken about this, and it's absolutely right that officials at the Home Office treat members of Parliament and their staff with the respect they deserve, and that we ensure that they get the relevant meetings and decisions, and anything I can do to facilitate that to him or indeed any other colleague, of course I will do.
Mark Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having completed the course, I would like to thank Sergeant Richard Neves and West Yorkshire Police for organising my participation in the Parliamentary Police and Fire Service scheme. Would the Minister agree with me that members from across the House should be encouraged to take part in this scheme if they want to gain a greater understanding of the pressures and challenges our police officers face on a day-to-day basis?
Minister.
Well, I'd like to join my honourable friend in thanking Sergeant Richard Neves for the work he did, encouraging and helping my honourable friend participate in the Parliamentary Police and Fire Service scheme. And yes, I would agree. I think members from right across the House should definitely engage in the scheme.
Dr. Rupahat.
When 172 men, women and children were asylum applicants in Acton were bused suddenly to Ashford in Kent, 80 miles away from their schools, NHS networks and faith communities, it made the TV news because the private provider of hotel accommodation wanted that back. Could she look into this case? Because there's a very human cost of uprooting families at the drop of a hat, as well as the taxpayer waste of money to shift people around hotel to hotel when they could be contributing and paying in if they were processed faster.
Well, the reality is that the accommodation pressure that we're seeing today is a symptom of a broader problem that is being unprecedented numbers of people arriving here illegally at a level that we've not seen before. That's putting pressure on the system to find and provide accommodation for these people. We have a duty to accommodate them. We need to stop the crossings, and therefore that will ease the pressure on accommodation.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognise the agreement reached this morning with the French to stop illegal migrant cross English Channel small boats. But what else will she do in terms of taking lessons from other European countries? Germany and Sweden, for example, don't recognise refugee applications from Albania. Countries like Italy and also Poland are physically stopping people from crossing their border illegally. What more will be done to tackle this problem?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is right that there is a real need for a multi-pronged approach. And whilst it's not quite right that countries like Germany or Sweden don't accept asylum applications, what it rather is that they may have higher burdens of proof or higher thresholds that need to be met. What we need to do is we need to change some of the regimes that are governing asylum and some of the rights that are being claimed, in large cases unmeritoriously. We will be making an announcement on the measures that we are taking in due course.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Minister to his place, and can I ask him to meet with me to discuss an Afghan spousal visa case I have been dealing with for over a year, as Pakistan will not grant her a visa so that she can travel to a biometrics appointment.
Minister.
Well, I'd be very happy to look into that case for the Honourable Lady.
Sajid Javid.
Mr. Speaker, of all the issues the Home Secretary has to deal with, few are more harrowing than child sexual abuse. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse recently reported that there was 8.8 million attempts to access such imagery online in the UK in just a single month. So can I ask my right honourable friend if the online safety bill will include a provision for UK companies to report such content to the NCA, and will she work with her colleagues to bring forward the bill this year?
Minister.
This issue is very close to the Right Honourable Member's heart and to mine. The Government is committed to tackling all forms of child sexual abuse to keep children safe at home, outside and online. In relation to this issue, there's a lot of good work being done by the NCA and also GCHQ. In relation to timing, I'm hopeful that we will have some news on that imminently.
Talking to you.
When it comes to migration policy, Mr. Speaker, it's we with working with the French Republic. But when it comes to bespoke policies for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to deal with demographics and labour shortages, it's no, no, no. So can the Minister tell us what's the difference? Why are we not allowed bespoke policies in his government working with the Scottish Parliament to enable us to do it?
We have no internal border.
Because we're all blessed to live in one united kingdom, and there's no material difference. Scotland's unemployment rate was 3.3% and economic inactivity rate was 21% in the recent figures, compared to the UK average of 3.5% and 21% respectively. So it's more important that we work together as one UK, and that's exactly the terms on which my right honourable friend has just concluded this very important agreement.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, whilst cooperation with the French is no doubt welcome, is it not the case that since 2015 the British taxpayer has subsidised the French police force to the tune of £200 million? And is it since then a record number have been intercepted, but an even higher record number have made it across the Channel? So can he confirm that there is nothing in this agreement today which obliges the French police to detain and arrest anybody they intercept, so that they are free to come back the following night and try again, in which case we're not throwing good money after bad?
Secretary of State.
I don't believe this is throwing good money after bad, because as I said, this year alone we've seen 30,000 successful interventions by the French to stop attempts to leave France and come here illegally. That's a very impressive record. It's not enough because it's not fixing the problem. That's why increasing the number of gendarmes, which is agreed under this deal, that's why the embedded observers, joint working at a real level on the ground between the UK and the French, I believe will take us forward in combating the scourge.
Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a huge problem of the over-policing of black children due to the adultification where minors are treated as adults. 799 children aged between 10 and 17 were strip-searched by the Met between 2019 and 2021, without any of them leading to an arrest. We need an urgent, independent investigation into the over-policing of black children. Will the Minister commit to one?
Minister.
I know this is an issue dear to the heart of the member. The police have to use the powers that they do have very carefully to target the right sort of offenders, and it is of concern that this can sometimes appear to be disproportionate. Nobody should be stopped and searched because of their age, because of their race or their ethnicity. There is the PACE codes of conduct and there is the use of body-worn video data. Around 40% of stop searches that take place in London are of young men. And
sit down, David Davis.
Clearly a very good thing, but is the Home Secretary entirely confident she is going to have sufficient aerial surveillance assets in place that we can do our half of the job properly?
Seriously?
Well, I have visited our clandestine command control team, headed up by Dan O'Mahony and border force officials, and we have a military presence. There is some very impressive technology which is being used, whether that's surveillance, drone technology, enabling and facilitating better cooperation with the French.
Turner.
Why is the government continuing to extend the temporary offshore wind workers' concession? The industry isn't even asking for it, but the government keep extending it. Would a minister meet with me to discuss this issue?
Quick yes or no will do.
Well, I'd be happy to meet with the honourable gentleman, but the extension was reviewed by the government, and on the basis of the representations made to us by the industry, we have reviewed it to April 2023. But if the honourable gentleman has heard other representations, I'd be pleased to hear them.
Tom Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday we found out that Ipswich Borough Council's temporary injunction to prevent the Nove Hotel being used for up to 200 economic migrants was unsuccessful. More to the point, the owners are now saying it might have 12 months, not 6 months. I heard in the media the government might be moving away from hotels towards temporary accommodation such as pontings. Could the Minister give me an update on what the plan is for moving away from hotels to much more basic and cheap accommodation?
Minister.
Well, we want to exit hotels as soon as possible, including that in my honourable friend's constituency. We want to move to simple but decent accommodation that doesn't provide an additional pull factor to the UK. But the challenge is very considerable, as we're having 40,000 people making that perilous crossing every year, placing immense pressure on our asylum system and preventing us from providing the kind of humane and compassionate response that we want to those people coming here in genuine peril.
Madeira Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, last week the new Met Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, came to Twickenham to meet community representatives, and he said one of the biggest pressures facing his officers is dealing with large numbers of mental health cases, sometimes multiple officers spending entire shifts with those in mental health crisis because the NHS doesn't have a bed for them. Could the Minister outline what his department or her department is doing to work with the NHS to ensure that the provision is in place so officers are out dealing with burglaries and catalytic converter theft, which is what my constituents are worried about?
Yeah, well, I think the Honourable Lady is raising a very important and valid point. I've had a similar conversation with Sir Mark just a couple of weeks ago, and I was out with officers in my own borough, Croydon, the week before last, and the emergency response team in Croydon told a very similar story. This is a topic which Sir Stephen House is looking into as part of his review into police productivity, but I also plan to have discussions with colleagues across government, including DHSC and NHS England, to find out what more we can do, because the issue he is raising is certainly a real one.
I think it's vital that our police forces draw on the very best talent from our communities, including those people who excel outside of the classroom. Following our discussions, can you update the House on future plans for entry routes into policing?
Secretary.
Well, may I just thank my honourable friend and other honourable colleagues for their important campaigning to ventilate this issue. He speaks not only with passion, but also with a deep understanding of the issue. I very much agree with him. I think that there are people from all walks of life who don't necessarily have a degree or want one, who can be very, very good police officers. And that's why I've asked the College of Policing to consider options for a new non-degree entry route to complement the existing framework. Current transitional arrangements will be extended in the meantime, and I'm very clear that the police force must be open to those who neither have or want a degree.
Final question, Kim Blanchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Ballyon we continue to face serious problems around antisocial behaviour, reckless driving and dangerous parking. Ultimately, I know that behaviour change is key, but in the short term, neighbourhood police and local councils need the resources to catch and punish those who show no respect to our communities. So when will the government properly invest in neighbourhood policing, and when will they stop cutting already stretched council budgets so that councils can use their power to tackle dangerous parking?
Who's the Minister?
Well, council budgets are obviously a matter for DLUC and will be set out in the local government funding settlement in a few weeks' time. But when it comes to police budgets, which are the Home Office's responsibility, as I've said once or twice already, the budget this year is £1.1 billion higher than it was last year. It stands now at £16.9 billion. And by April of next year, when the police uplift programme is complete, we'll have more uniformed police officers recruited than at any time in our country's history.
That completes questions. We now come to the statement. We'll call Minister James Heappey. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. West Africa is an important region for the United Kingdom and our allies across Europe, and the UK is strongly committed to supporting the UN to deliver its peacekeeping commitments around the world. That is why, since 2018, we had been supporting the French-led counter-terrorism mission in Mali with CH-47 Chinook helicopters under Operation Barkhane, and more recently, since 2020, through the deployment of a long-range reconnaissance group as part of the UN's MINUSMA peacekeeping mission. The House will be aware, however, that in February, President Macron announced the drawdown of French troops in Mali and was joined in that announcement by all other European nations, as well as Canada, that were contributing to the French-led Operations Barkhane and Takuba. In March, Sweden announced that it would be leaving the UN's MINUSMA mission. Today, Mr. Speaker, I can announce that the UK contingent will also now be leaving the MINUSMA mission earlier than planned. Mr. Speaker, we should be clear that responsibility for all of this sits in Bamako. 2 coups in 3 years have undermined international efforts to advance peace. On my most recent visit last November, I met with the Malian Defence Minister and implored him to see the huge value of the French-led international effort in his country. However, soon afterwards, the Malian government began working with the Russian mercenary group Wagner and actively sought to interfere with the work of both the French-led and UN missions. The Wagner group is linked to mass human rights abuses. The Malian government's partnership with Wagner group is counterproductive to lasting stability and security in their region. Mr. Speaker, this government cannot deploy our nation's military to provide security when the host country's government is not willing to work with us to deliver lasting stability and security. However, our commitment to West Africa and the important work of the UN is undiminished. We've been working closely with our allies to consider options for rebalancing our deployment alongside France, the EU and other like-minded allies. On Monday and Tuesday next week, Mr. Speaker, I will join colleagues from across Europe and West Africa in Accra to coordinate our renewed response to instability in the Sahel. This will be the first major gathering in support of the Accra Initiative, a West African-led solution focused initially on preventing further contagion of the insurgency into Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin and Niger, and tackling growing levels of violence in Burkina Faso as well as Mali, making this a very timely conference indeed. And of course, Mr. Speaker, it's not just the UK military that will remain committed in West Africa. The UK will continue its commitment to Mali and the Sahel through our humanitarian, stabilisation and development assistance, working in close coordination with partners. Nor, Mr. Speaker, is this a reduction in our commitment to the United Nations. The UK remains an important contributor of troops through Operation Tosca in Cyprus and staff officers across several missions and provide training to around 10,000 military, police and civilian peacekeepers from a range of countries annually. We remain the 5th largest financial contributor and will continue to drive reform in New York. Indeed, we are working with New York on developing a pilot to be delivered through the British Peace Support Team based in Nairobi to develop the capacity of UN troop-contributing nations across Africa. Mr. Speaker, we will of course coordinate with allies as we draw down from Gao and have been sharing our plans with them over recent months. The Army will be issuing orders imminently to reconfigure the next deployment to draw down our presence. We are leaving the MINUSMA mission earlier than planned and are of course saddened by the way the government in Bamako has made it so difficult for well-meaning nations to remain there. The work of our troops has been outstanding, and they should be proud of what they've achieved there. But through the Chilcot report and our wider experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, we, like so many allies, are clear that the military instrument should not be deployed on counterinsurgency or countering violent extremism missions unless there is a clear and compelling commitment towards political progress. We will work quickly with allies in the region and across Europe to support the Accra Initiative to deliver security, stability and prosperity in West Africa. Our commitment to that region is undiminished.
We now call the Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for the advance copy of his statement. He always treats this House with great courtesy, but I have to say I was disappointed, Mr. Speaker, as you will be, that nearly 3 hours before I received a copy of the statement, I was reading about this decision in the Times Online. MINUSMA is the UN's deadliest peacekeeping mission, Mr. Speaker, with 281 fatalities to date. So I want to start by paying tribute to all those British troops who've been deployed with the UN in Mali since 2020, and to all those RAF air and ground crew who've been deployed in Mali since 2013. Mr. Speaker, the UN Security Council only renewed the Mali mission's mandate in June, which Britain strongly supported. What now for the UN's MINUSMA force without the UK's long-range specialised reconnaissance? What now for the UK's contribution to stabilising the Sahel, which has become what experts say is the new epicentre of terrorism? What now for the neighbouring states to Mali, who look to the UK for support in the face of increasing activity from Islamic extremist groups? And what now for the West's capacity to balance the Russian Wagner Group mercenaries in the region? Will the Chinook deployment continue to support the UN mission? The Times reported that this has already been withdrawn, though the Minister has not mentioned it this afternoon. And when exactly will the current Royal Scots Light Dragoons on the ground in Mali actually be withdrawn? Mr. Speaker, this statement is long overdue. France announced the withdrawal of troops from Mali back in February, and when I asked the Defence Secretary about this days later, he said the UK was, I quote, now reviewing our next steps. I got the same answer nearly 4 months later when I asked again. Now, fully 9 months after France, 8 months after Sweden, why has it taken Britain so long to make the same decision? We need strategic planning and foresight from ministers for this region, not the tactical silence while they work out what on earth to do. Now, President Macron marked the end of the French Barkhane operation last week by pledging a new strategy within half a year for working with African countries. Is the UK working with France on this new strategy? Will the government produce a similar UK strategy? In the government's 2020 integrated review, there was just one passing reference to the Sahel and 2 short factual statements about Mali. Will the current IR update make good this Sahel-shaped gap in the UK's strategic security thinking? And finally, Mr. Speaker, ahead of the autumn statement, today's decision on reducing our commitment to UK United Nations peacekeeping is a reminder of how important it is to have clarity over UK defence spending. The Defence Secretary agreed the current spending settlement, giving the MOD back in 2020 a 1.4 billion real cut in day-to-day spending. He now says, and he told the Defence Select Committee, inflationary pressures on my budget for the next 2 years is about £8 billion. So how much does Defence actually need from the Chancellor on Thursday to plug the Defence Secretary's budget black hole.
Just before the Minister comes in, I've just actually seen what's been given to the Times. I am disappointed because I have the greatest respect for the Minister, but I think it's pretty appalling that somebody decided to hand it to the Times, putting online exactly what you've given to the House. So I hope that you'll look into somebody in the department, whoever's passed this on to the Times, will be reprimanded and reminded that members of this House come first, not the media. James Healy.
Mr. Speaker, I could not agree more. I think you know that the Secretary of State and I are not the sort of ministers that play these games. There was no deliberate briefing of this. We're very angry that somebody within our organisation has done the discourtesy that you should read about this in the Times rather than hear about it from the dispatch box. That was not the plan. Mr. Speaker, there was a long list of questions. I'll do my best to rattle through them. Some of them I think I covered in the statement. What's next for the UN force? I mean, I think that the UN was already in a process of reconfiguration given the changes in troop contributing countries that they were facing and the reality of the situation on the ground, where the insurgency has moved from the tri-border area of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso to now really be further south in Burkina. The challenge in the north of the country is no longer really the insurgency against the Al-Qaeda affiliate Janim or Islamic State Greater Sahel. It is more back to it being competing tribes as it was 5 or 6 years ago. And in the south of the country, really what the Malians are mostly focused on is the survival of the junta that came to pass. There's a very incoherent set of security challenges, and I think the UN is trying to navigate those. And I think the UN would be the first to admit that MINUSMA as a mission is struggling as a consequence of those three very different challenges within the country. And that leads, Mr. Speaker, to the Right Honourable Gentleman's absolutely correct question about stabilising the wider Sahel. I think it would be erroneous to think that MINUSMA, that was a UN mission struggling to match the excellent military endeavour of troop-contributing countries with any meaningful political progress, was really doing anything to stabilise the Sahel. The centre of mass of the insurgency has moved south into Burkina. The competition in Burkina is now very acute. Prigozhin has been in Ouagadougou recently offering Wagner's services, and I think everybody is concerned that this is now about avoiding contagion from Burkina, making sure that we work with the Burkinabe armed forces in order to get after the insurgency where it now is, because that is the heart of the challenge in the Sahel. And that's what the Accra Initiative, Mr. Speaker, is really aiming to get after. It's a West African designed solution to a problem that is in West Africa, and what the UK, France, the EU and others are seeking to do is to get in behind the Accra Initiative, because we think that is the most credible option for restoring stability in the Sahel. Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman asked sort of why now, why wasn't there a rush to make a decision back in February when the French left? Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman knows that there are other countries from Europe who have continued. We've been in discussion with them about what we should do and what looks like the most sensible route forward. I think to have rushed to make a decision back then before we were sure what the right solution was in West Africa would have been a knee-jerk. I think the right thing to do, as I've been doing, is to travel around the region. I've been in Mali, in Ghana, in Côte d'Ivoire and in Togo. My counterparts from France have been extensively visiting Niger, Benin and other countries as well. And between us, we've been able to map out what we think the best solution is. The CH-47 commitment to Barkhane was indeed already drawn down. I believe that was the subject of a previous written ministerial statement when the Barkhane decision was made, although the Chinooks were left to help the French move out of Mali, but they have not been actively participating in Barkhane since Barkhane ended, and the casualty evacuation capability for MINUSMA remains for as long as MINUSMA is patrolling. I think the IR's relevance is actually borne out by the conclusion we've come to, because the IR's decision was around capacity building upstream and recognising that often our presence can be the catalyst to insurgency. That's very much what the West African nations feel. They don't want us to be on their borders physically fighting the insurgency. They think that that accelerates things. They want us to be working with them to support them in generating the capability. And finally, Mr. Speaker, on defence spending, we all wait for Thursday.
James Dudridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As ever, the honourable gentleman shows a mastery not only of defence but also a very complicated politics within Mali. Clearly, after Barkhane kind of closed, the French left, it was only a matter of time before there was a withdrawal, particularly of the Chinooks, which were providing the heavy lift for the French. If the French weren't there, it simply didn't make sense. The honourable gentleman touches on the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group have a pervasive influence across the Sahel into West Africa and further south. Could I ask the honourable gentleman to consider that this could be a lot worse after Ukraine, because a lot of the armed combatants from the Wagner Group have been sucked into the Ukraine conflict, and if there was a resolution within that conflict, I suspect the Wagner Group would flood back into West Africa, causing problems not only in the countries that he mentioned, but further south in places like Zimbabwe.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I very much enjoyed working with the Right Honourable Gentleman when he was the Minister for Africa. It's a shame, however, that his collection of African ties have been put out to retirement. They were quite something. Mr. Speaker, he is absolutely right that the role that Wagner is playing in Africa is very different to the one it's playing in Ukraine. In Ukraine, it is effectively generating a force apparently conscripted from Russian prisons to augment the Russian front line as a manoeuvre element. In Africa, the role they're playing is somewhat different. In Mali, they are there principally at the invitation of the coup leadership to ensure the survival of the coup. In the Central African Republic, they've been doing something broadly similar, but in the process actually been engaged more widely in the security in that country. Nobody should pretend that Wagner is up to any good. They are universally up to mischief. But across Africa, they are doing different things depending on what the governments that have brought them in have asked them to do. But they remain a bunch of murderous, human rights abusing thugs, and there isn't a country on the planet that is any better for their presence.
We go to SNP spokesperson Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the comments you made around the leak to the Times Online. Can I say to the Minister that we certainly commend the bravery and dedication of UK Armed Forces personnel who have been serving with the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali. So can I ask the Minister, just picking up on the theme of the Wagner Group, will he detail fully what diplomatic steps have been taken to address the presence of Wagner Group combatants in Malawi and elsewhere in the world, and whether we're looking at individually sanctioning Wagner Group fighters present in Mali? Will he present to the House what work the recently announced Office of Conflict Stabilisation and Mediation and the Conflict and Atrocity Prevention Hub will undertake, the exact funding and staffing levels, and given that he has said that his commitment to the Sahel region is undiminished, is the government looking at reversing the cuts to the Sahel region in aid, including cuts to the Conflict Stability and Security Fund?
Mr. Speaker, there's a little bit of noise behind me. I didn't catch the middle part of his question, which is about an office that's been set up. I will check the record and write to him on that. On the wider effort in West Africa, it goes without saying that the military instrument alone will not be the answer to any of West Africa's problems. There has to be a political and economic track that sits alongside the military. I would suggest that the vehicle through which that economic and political track is most effectively delivered is through ECOWAS. Now, the EU has got very strong relationships with ECOWAS, and I think that it's likely that the EU will therefore be in the lead on that. But when I've been in Abuja, I also have met with ECOWAS officials, and I see them as, and so the UK will obviously engage with ECOWAS on that wider development, economic, political track, as well as the stuff we're doing militarily with Ghana and the Accra Initiative.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, can I please thank the Minister for his statement? It is, of course, disappointing, as I suspect that our withdrawal will exacerbate the very reasons for our deployment in the first place, but I clearly accept political judgment. Can I please ask the Minister to confirm to the House that the UK force protection profile will be maintained in full accordance with the threat as we withdraw?
Mr. Speaker, it absolutely will. The long-range reconnaissance patrolling will stop almost immediately, but the force that follows on the next rotation to deliver the drawdown will, of course, have within it everything that is needed for full force protection.
Very much indeed. Mr. Speaker, the UK Deputy Permanent Representative told the UN Security Council on the 10th of October that the UK supports MINUSMA, and we should pay tribute to the bravery of those troops given the losses my right honourable friend referred to, but said there were questions about whether and how the mission can maintain a viable presence in Mali. Now, given that the factors, political instability, the Wagner Group and others, that have led to the withdrawal of French, UK and troops from other nations, what is the government's view about the continued operation of MINUSMA in the circumstances they now find themselves in?
Well, I think that is a matter for the UN, but as I said in response to the right honourable gentleman's question, our view is that the MINUSMA mission is stagnant. The political track has not been advancing for a number of years, since the first coup, in fact, arguably before. And therefore, a very successful military mission has been undermined by the lack of progress in Bamako. I think there is also a wider point whereby the mandate for that UN mission, just like the UN missions in the Central African Republic and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, are exclusively around peacekeeping. And if there isn't a peace to keep, those missions can feel rather toothless as a consequence. So these are all the things that we are communicating in New York. We, as I've said in response to a number of colleagues' questions, we want to be very constructive. We feel like we have some understanding of what's going on alongside the French as penholders. And what we want to see is a more cohesive approach to security in West Africa, probably with the security bit delivered by the Accra Initiative, ECOWAS doing the diplomatic and the economic track, and the UN being ready to keep the peace once it's made.
Earlier on this year, I had the opportunity to visit RAF Odium and see a stripped-down Chinook with that iconic red sand of Africa falling out of it. Does my right honourable friend agree that whilst this withdrawal is no reflection of the service of those that were in country, but also working so hard in the UK to support them? But could I press him slightly about what we're doing to combat Wagner Group in Africa? As a former trade envoy, I think the opportunities for the peoples of Africa and the UK to work together for mutually beneficial trade is enormous and threatened by this instability that the Wagner Group brings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I firstly echo my honourable friend's praise for the troops that have been involved. The Chinook force have been involved for a long time, and they've been on quite an aggressive rotation of operations, particularly the engineers, and they've done extraordinary work keeping the Chinooks flying in very difficult conditions. She's also right about the wider challenge of Wagner. They are very opportunistic. They appear in countries where they think there is opportunity for them to win business, but they are deeply exploitative. You know, they invariably ask for payment through mineral wealth or access to oil and gas. And the country that we offer to many African colleagues as an example is Mozambique, where Wagner were taken in and then kicked out because of the way that Wagner behaved when they were there. We communicate very keenly with countries across Africa about the dangers of taking Wagner in, and we try to show that when you engage with the UK, France, the US and other Western allies, you get a security partnership that wants nothing in return other than the advancement of our shared interests and security in the region.
Ward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his address to the House earlier this year, President Zelensky asked Parliament to proscribe the Wagner Group as a terrorist organisation following atrocities that it had committed in Ukraine. Reports suggest that since the coup in Mali, the Wagner Group has been linked to massacres in which hundreds of civilians have been killed. So will the Minister commit to speaking with the Home Secretary or the Security Minister about proscribing the Wagner Group as a terrorist organisation?
I certainly will.
Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Speaker, I was very interested that in the statement the Minister drew reference to the Chilcot report. And in the horrors of Mali and the terrible loss of life there, I understand the withdrawal of French and British troops. What I'd like him to be clear about is how many British troops are now going to be deployed in that region of Africa, and crucially, what is the long-term aim of this? What exactly are we getting ourselves into? Which is quite clearly why he drew reference to Chilcot, which said there had to be some clear aims and objectives before British troops were deployed overseas.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is right to ask the question. I don't think it's as binary as every soldier, sailor, aviator that is currently in Mali finds himself redeployed around Western Africa. My suspicion is that the Accra Initiative countries will be asking for slightly different capabilities to the long-range reconnaissance group that is currently in Mali. But very obviously, everything that we do to increase the capacity of Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Niger, to guard against further contagion and then to get after the insurgency in Burkina and then after it again in Mali, needs to be joined up with a wider regional economic and political plan, probably delivered by ECOWAS. Now, I don't know if the right honourable gentleman heard, but on Monday and Tuesday next week, I will be in Accra, where representatives of the EU, the UN, France, UK, ECOWAS and all of the member states of the Accra Initiative will be discussing exactly this, because we need a cohesive strategy that brings together military, political and economic.
Okay. Margaret Furrier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to put on record my deepest respect for those armed forces who have served in Mali. Does the Minister believe that with the rising threat from extremist groups in the region, withdrawal of troops could lead to an eventual outpouring of refugees, as we saw with Afghanistan?
No, Mr. Speaker, I don't, for the simple reason that where the UK troops are in Gao is now somewhat north of where the centre of mass of the insurgency is. You know, I think the argument that I'm making gently is that our position in Gao is not that relevant given where the security challenge in West Africa is, and that the real challenge now is getting after the insurgency in Burkina, making sure that in Ouagadougou there's an enthusiasm for working with Western allies, not Prigozhin and Wagner, and then you extend back out the security from Burkina. But that's where the challenge is at now, and that's what everybody's meeting in Accra next week to discuss.
Order, order, the Vice-Chamberlain of the Household.
I am to acquaint the House that I have a message from His Majesty the King to this House, signed by His Majesty's own hand.
To ensure continued efficiency of public business when I'm unavailable, such as while I'm undertaking official duties overseas, I can confirm that I will be most content should Parliament see fit for the number of people who may be called upon to be acts as Councillors of State under the terms of the Regency Acts of 1937 to 1953 to be increased to include my sister and brother, the Princess Royal and the Earl of Wessex and Forfar, both of whom have previously undertaken this role. Thank you. I understand that the Leader of the House wishes to raise a point of order. Point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from what you have just said, it may be of help if I inform the House that honourable members will have the opportunity to consider a response to His Majesty's gracious message ahead of the Opposition Day debate tomorrow. It may also help if I inform the House that there will be legislation relating to this message for the House to consider in due course. Should the House agree to the humble address as first business tomorrow, that legislation will provide a proper opportunity to debate the matter that has been raised. Thank you.
Can I thank the Leader of the House for that? Point of order, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on a point of order for which I've given you notice and the member for Ilford North. At last Wednesday's Prime Minister's question time, at the conclusion of it, I tried to raise a point of order asking why the Prime Minister had not given me prior notice of making reference to me in the Chamber. And during the few minutes that followed after that, you may not have heard it, the member for Ilford North used what I consider to be very unparliamentary and actually quite demeaning language towards people who suffer from dementia or senility in our society. And this has led to a lot of people contacting me who are very upset about this because they have loved ones that they've lost to dementia. I'd be grateful if you could just set out, Mr. Speaker, that this kind of language is totally unacceptable, as indeed is any other form of abuse of any type, and that it will not be repeated in this chamber, and you will absolutely not allow it to be repeated at any time.
Can I first of all say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, thank you for giving me notice of this point of order, and he raises two issues. On the first, the House's Rules of Behaviour document states that you should notify colleagues whenever you intend to refer to them in the chamber, other than making passing reference to what they have said on the public record. I've reminded the House of the rule on numerous occasions. However, in this context, I think the Prime Minister's comments can be taken as a passing reference to the public record of the Right Honourable Member when he was the leader of the Labour Party. To that extent, I'm not persuaded his notification in advance was required. However courteous it might have been to have given it. And I would always say it is nice if we can let people know as a general good form. In any event, the Right Honourable Gentleman raised the point with the Prime Minister in the statement which followed the PMQs and has once again been given the opportunity, and quite rightly, to put his side of the issue on the record. His second point, which I have greatest of sympathy, second point he raised is the comment said to have been made by the Honourable Member for Ilford North. I have to say, he's correct, I didn't hear the comment, which is not recorded on the official report, which I did check. Had I done so, I would have intervened, because I consider it falls well short of the respectful language and the tone we should all demonstrate. However, I understand the Honourable Member has written to apologise to the Right Honourable Member for Islington North and has had an opportunity to put his point on the record. And this gives me an opportunity to remind all members of the importance of good temper, moderation in the language we use in this chamber. And certainly it is not a good example to use it against each other. And I think we should learn from this. Now then, I'm now going to move on, but I do thank the Right Honourable Gentleman. Right. Just move to let people just clear away. We now come to the general debate on the Australia and New Zealand trade deals. I now call Minister Greg Hands to move.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Australia and New Zealand free trade agreements are deals that will deliver for people, businesses and our economy. These deals are our first from-scratch free trade agreements since we left the European Union, and they are deals that this country can be proud of. They demonstrate our ambition as an independent trading nation. They secure commitments that in places go above and beyond international best practice and put us at the forefront of international trade policy. And indeed, if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, I was here in June 2018 when we were finalising the call for input. I was here again as the Minister in June 2020 when the negotiations were launched. It's great to be back at the Department to see the deal having been done, and looking forward to many such similar deals as the Minister of Trade Policy. And delighted also that the Leader of the House, who was also recently in this role, was just sitting next to me discussing the important role that she played and the member for Berwick-upon-Tweed played over the last year as well. So, Mr. Speaker, we negotiated these ambitious deals with like-minded partners at pace but with diligence, going further and faster than, for example, the EU have been able to. The EU have yet to get a deal with Australia over the line and only recently concluded talks with New Zealand after 4 years. I should also pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for South West Norfolk, formerly the Prime Minister, the Trade Secretary throughout a large part of this process as well. The deals represent a deepening of our relationship with close allies, fellow members of the Five Eyes Intelligence Partnership, and like-minded democracies which share our beliefs in fairness, free enterprise, high standards and the rule of law. Last year, our bilateral trading relationship with Australia was worth £14.4 billion, and exports to Australia supported more than 100,000 UK jobs in 2016. And exports to New Zealand supported more than 16,000 UK jobs in 2016 as well. These deals will strengthen these links, supporting increased volumes of trade, jobs and wages, and bringing more choice for the UK consumer. But, Mr. Speaker, of course I will.
Very grateful to him for giving way. He will be aware that the Australia deal in particular has created quite a lot of concern amongst Britain's farmers. For example, Gilly Green of the Suckler Beef Producers Association said this is an absolute betrayal. This is Christmas all over for Australia. And the former chief economist of the NFU said agriculture is going to bear a disproportionate cost. So desperate are the government to do deals that they are preparing to slim down agriculture. How would he respond to those observations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to respond because I've had extensive interaction myself with all of the 4 or 5 nations, NFUs, during this whole process. And we have delivered a deal, of course, that phases in the change. Now, he might reference the fact, of course, the European Union in the trade deal that we have with them, which he supported, gives, of course, the EU comprehensive access from day one. This phases in access for Australia and New Zealand for a period of up to 15, in some cases 20 years. I think that is worth giving consideration to, and also the extensive interaction we've had with the NFU, with farmers. I've met with MPs, their constituency farmers at some length, and we'll continue to interact with the NFU and all of the nation NFUs as well, to make sure that we are in full listening mode when it comes to Britain's essential farming community. Of course.
Further to the intervention from the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central, I've got a copy of the Tier here, which is the FUW's monthly publication, and what they say is this, Mr. Speaker: there will always be winners and losers when it comes to negotiating liberalised free trade agreements, and it's clear from the UK government's impact assessments that UK agriculture will be one of the losers if these deals are ratified. Is it not the case that there's widespread concern amongst the agricultural communities that the British government are selling them down the river?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I disagree with that, and I'm just checking back my records, a very extensive interactions with NFU Cymru during the negotiation process. I met them on the 19th of May 2021. I met the Farmers Union of Wales the 19th of May as well. The 26th of May I met them. The 16th of June I met them. The 13th of September I met them. And it was very important for us to get the confidence of the farming community of Wales. I did also various Zoom calls at the time because it was a time of one of the lockdowns with MPs and their constituent farmers and so on. And of course, what I would say to him is this, is that the protections that we have in the deal are very, very considerable. For example, that the TRQs carry on for, in some cases, 10 years. Product-specific measures there to protect sensitive agricultural produce from years 10 to 15, bilateral safeguard mechanisms, and so on. There's a lot of protections there. Of course, I will take a further intervention in just a moment, but perhaps he might explain to me what his position might be. Will his party ever support a single trade deal that has been proposed either by the European Union or by the UK government? Perhaps he might tell us that.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not very often you get the opportunity to do so, Prime Minister. I'm very happy to say, when there's a good trade deal for Welsh farmers, I'll be very happy to support it. The Minister will be aware, of course, that further to his point with NFU Cymru, the Farmers Union of Wales, both unions in Wales, have expressed concerns about the cumulative impact of various trade deals. I wonder, has that featured in any assessments that the Department has made? And if so, could he share with us what he makes to these concerns of the cumulative impact that Welsh farmers are very, very concerned about?
Well, I welcome, first of all, his support for trade deals, and I look forward to him perhaps one day voting for one of them. I might just add this. In terms of the impact on Welsh farmers, I might point out some of the market access that we have recently gained. For example, Welsh lamb being able to enter the US market for the first time in many decades, due to the United States removing the small ruminants rule. I was in Taiwan only last week trying to negotiate again access for Welsh lamb to the Taiwan market. And I think when it comes to the accumulation, he ought to think about the fact that there is, of course, tariff-free, quota-free access for the European Union at the moment for the UK, and that has been the case from day one of the trade and the TCA. So, Mr. Speaker, of course I'll allow the member for Birmingham.
Can I help the Minister a little? Because surely one of the points we ought to be looking at is the fact that about a third of the beef consumed in the UK is imported already. Some of it, of course, from Brazil and concerns about deforestation there, but also a very big amount from the EU, primarily from Ireland. So what we may be seeing is not competition for fresh beef from Australia, but maybe import substitution. Maybe that will be part of the equation.
Yes, I thank the member for Worley for that intervention. He makes a very, very strong point. We are all in favour of competition. We're also in favour, of course, of consumers having the ability to make that choice. I would just add to the important points that he makes, of course, that the farmers in Australia and New Zealand, the exports of their meat is much more likely to go to Far Eastern markets. A big percentage currently of Australian and New Zealand exports go to those Far Eastern markets that frankly we would like to get access to through joining the CPTPP trade agreement. You know, we want to have a piece of that action as well. But he is right that in terms of it's more likely that they might be displacing imports from the EU and give consumers choice in the matter. But, Mr. Speaker, these are more than just deals with like-minded and long-standing partners. They are part of the UK's new strategic approach to internet. Of course, I'll give way.
Just follow on his point. Before we entered the common market, the Australian-New Zealand agricultural juggernaut was centred on this country for its trade. Now, as he said, they're going to 100 or more countries. So it's spread. Pre-common market, our farmers survived, they didn't complain, and they will continue to do so.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, who is an expert when it comes to connections between the United Kingdom and the continent of Australasia. And he also makes a very, very good point about restoring trading connections that were there prior to this country's membership of the European Union. We should be treating these trade deals as an opportunity, not as a threat, a point he also makes well. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, these deals are a key part of our Indo-Pacific tilt. I'll make a bit more progress first. The Indo-Pacific region matters to the UK. It is critical to our economy, our security, and our global ambition to support open societies. Rapid economic growth in the Indo-Pacific region is shifting the world's centre of economic gravity eastwards. In the first 2 decades of this century, the Indo-Pacific region accounted for 50% of global economic growth in real terms. By 2050, that is expected to be 56%. Home to half the world's people, there are significant economic opportunities for the UK in trading with this region, and these deals are just the start. And these 2 agreements are also a significant step towards our accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. Membership of CPTPP will further open up 11 Pacific markets across 4 continents, worth £9 trillion in GDP in 2021. Joining will put the UK at the heart of a dynamic group of growing nations. As the UK, Madam Deputy Speaker, we negotiate deals that are tailored to our strengths, such as our world-class services industries, which employ 82% of our workforce and account for 80% of our economy. These deals will unlock new markets, create jobs, and drive the growth which the UK, like many other countries, needs right now. They will provide real outcomes to real businesses. I will give way to the Honourable Lady. Yes.
Thank the Minister for giving way. What does he make of the Select Committee's findings that more export opportunities and greater safeguards for the food industry could have been negotiated? How is the government implementing lessons learned for future deals?
Well, Madam Speaker, I thank the International Trade Committee for their various reports into both deals, and I look forward to engaging with the Chair and indeed the whole committee. I think, of course, when looking at any negotiation, any negotiated deal, there's always a way of saying that something might have been better, but that is always, if you like, the inevitable consequence of a negotiation. you sometimes have a bit of give and take. What I would say is in terms of the safeguards for UK agriculture, those are built in over a very considerable length of time, 15, in some cases 20 years, as a time to adjust. And I just contrast that, for example, with the deal, with the European Union, which I know that she voted against. She voted, I think, to have no deal with the European Union, but that European Union deal, of course, gave access instantly. So today, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to explain to the House how these important deals will help firms in every part of the country to flourish and grow. First, these agreements will remove 100% of tariffs on all goods, most of which will come into effect as soon as the agreements are in force, so particularly with reference to UK exports. They will reduce red tape on British goods sold to Australian and New Zealand markets, making our exports even more competitive. Our automotive sector is among the many UK industries that will reap the rewards. McLaren, for example, says these tariff reductions will support and facilitate customer and network growth across Australia in the coming years. Nissan says that removing the 5% duty on car exports will help to further exports to Australian customers of the Leaf, Qashqai and Juke cars it makes at its Sunderland plant. While the removal of tariffs of up to 10% on car parts and on some vehicles sold to New Zealand is good news for other vehicle manufacturers across the UK. A whole range of other industries will also benefit. For example, Nairns, the Edinburgh-based oatcake manufacturer, says savings from removing 5% tariffs under our New Zealand deal will help offset the increased costs that have affected businesses following COVID-19 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the Food and Drink Federation, Madam Deputy Speaker, believes the removal of a range of tariffs will help UK businesses significantly growth opportunities and make them more competitive in the New Zealand market. UK investors will benefit from more access than ever before to opportunities in Australia and New Zealand, with guaranteed rights to invest across the economy. We are maximising opportunities for British companies to invest and grow their businesses in Australia. It'll be easier for UK businesses to expand into both Australia and New Zealand because we have increased the screening thresholds in both deals, meaning fewer UK investments will be subject to review. And we secured outcomes which encourage further inward investment into the nations and regions across the UK. In 2020, the UK was the second most popular destination for Australian foreign direct investment, and Australia is a big global investor. In 2019, there were over 2,000 Australian-owned local business units in the UK, employing more than 71,000 people. And in 2020, we were the fourth largest destination for foreign direct investment from New Zealand. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, Australia and New Zealand trade deals will also give our services industries a competitive edge on data and digital as well. 80%, of course, of our economy is in services. The deal, for example, benefits Scotland's financial services industry, engineering services firms in the West Midlands, and provide new opportunities for Welsh fintech firms in Cardiff. Our Australia deal allows professionals in areas like engineering, accountancy and architecture to get visas to work. The law firm, for example, Herbert Smith Freehills, says these measures will make it easier for their staff to work across the UK and Australia. We also have access to the £10 billion government procurement market in Australia, putting our firms on an equal footing with Australian firms as well. Just last month, Madam Deputy Speaker, I visited Informed Solutions, which is headquartered in Altrincham, and its management told me how they were looking forward to the ratification of the upcoming FTAs to assist their business as well. We have world-leading digital chapters, we have opportunities in cyber security trade, and so on. We also have SME chapter, very, very important for helping smaller, medium-sized companies be able to navigate a free trade agreement. And my department too is working hard at spelling out our many advantages to businesses, large and small. The national chairman of the Federation of Small Businesses, Mike Cherry, said that our trade deal with Australia was great news for many of its members, as the small business chapter would ensure that the needs of small businesses are fully catered for in the years to come. Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for International Trade, often likens trade agreements to new motorways. They are at their most useful when they are well used by cars. That is why my team is meeting companies around the country to explain how they can make full use of our deals. And of course, businesses that want to trade with Australia and New Zealand and need more personalised help can turn to our network of trade advisors. Madam Deputy Speaker, I reflect on the many economic advantages offered by our free trade agreements. However, these deals are not just about commerce, they're also about creating deeper international partnerships that will benefit both our citizens and the wider world, as well as our wider strategic objectives. Of course.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and on this point about making sure that this isn't just about economic benefits, it's also about the social partnership and ensuring that workers' hard-won rights are not undermined by doing a trade deal which could lead to a race to the bottom. Could you explain why the deals don't contain any commitment to the ILO core conventions?
Well, I thank him for that intervention. I know that he takes a very strong, keen and constant interest in these issues. I just say to him that the UK's commitment to human rights, to workers' rights, to various social justices are not always best pursued through trade agreements. We do pursue those bilaterally as well. I do not believe that there are any widespread concerns in relation to Australia and New Zealand, but I'm happy for him to write to me if he's got concerns about workers' rights in those two countries. It's not obvious to me how necessarily a trade deal would be the best way to pursue those objectives in any case. So together our nations can use trade. I'm going to make a bit of progress and then conclude to address contemporary challenges like economic degradation, health pandemics and threats to global security. And both of these deals support this endeavour, including provisions that uphold high standards and foster cooperation on shared challenges. With world-leading chapters on trade and gender equality, the deals demonstrate our commitment to break down barriers that exist for women in trade, whether as workers, business owners or entrepreneurs. The UK-Australia agreement contains an innovation chapter, which is the first of its kind in any FTA between two partners in the world. This will ensure our trading relationship remains at the forefront of emerging technologies. If I might just add, Madam Deputy Speaker, the CBI said that our deal with New Zealand puts us at the fore of the green trade revolution and can showcase to the world that trade and climate change can go hand in hand. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll take an intervention. Yep.
Grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister talked earlier on about allowing the British public the chance to purchase in a competitive environment. But competition requires information. If there is no chapter, no adequate chapter in the Australia Agreement, for example, about environmental standards, about the use of coal, can you tell the House how it is possible for an educated consumer to buy in the way that he suggests?
Well, actually, Madam Speaker, he raises a very, very good point, because the UK-Australia deal is the first Australia trade deal that has a dedicated chapter to the environment. So I would recommend that he have a look at the deal and see what it does for the environment. And this is something which, of course, we take very seriously indeed. We did it in the run-up to COP, so it was very topical as well. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the country's departure from... I'm going to finish. Departure from the European Union opened up new possibilities for us to enhance our relationships with the rest of the world. And our deals with Australia and New Zealand show that we are seizing this opportunity. These deals can increase annual trade between the UK and Australia and New Zealand by 12.1 billion. I'm looking forward, Madam Deputy Speaker, to hearing the contributions from the official opposition, which I think abstained on the second reading on the Australia and New Zealand bill, and also from the Liberal Democrats, and also from the SNP, who I think opposed the second reading of the Australia and New Zealand Free Trade Agreement bill. Perhaps the former leader of the Liberal Democrats can explain why he was so opposed to doing the deal.
However he chooses to give way to me, I'm extremely grateful to him. We are very, very strongly in favour of free trade, but we also believe free trade has to be fair. And to take him back to his comment earlier on about the strategic value of this, does he understand that trade deals have to have strategic value in terms of protecting our ability to feed ourselves as a country? Does he understand why those who represent rural communities are deeply concerned about the imbalance when it comes to farm standards on this side of the country or the world, and New Zealand and Australia on the other, and that we think that might undermine our ability to feed ourselves because it will put British farmers out of business?
Well, Madam Speaker, I am looking forward to him actually supporting one of these trade deals. I've already pointed out the safeguards that are there in both deals. The long transition period, the substantial tariff rate quotas, all of those protections and safeguards that are in there for British farmers. The non-regression clause, for example, on animal welfare, which will prevent Australia or any other country from seeking to gain a trade advantage if it were to weaken its animal welfare rules, which, I'll be frank, I've seen no evidence Australia would be looking to do that. But it does have protection there for our farmers and our consumers. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, our free trade agreements reflect the needs of modern business and play to this country's strengths. They will create deeper friendships between our citizens, and they will begin a new era of free trade between our nations. In short, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are free trade agreements for the 21st century, and I commend them to the House.
The question is that this House has considered the Australia and New Zealand trade deals. Shadow Secretary of State Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And today is the day, of course, of a significant birthday. And I would, of course, like to wish the Minister a happy birthday and also to say what better present could the Secretary of State have given him than being absent and allowing him to open the debate in her place today. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the fact that we are holding this general debate today on the Australia and New Zealand trade bills. And yesterday, Remembrance Sunday, was a powerful reminder of our shared history and shared past sacrifice. The UK, Australia and New Zealand have deep, enduring bonds, shared values and common goals. We on these benches support AUKUS, and we also recognise the key and central priorities that the UK, Australia and New Zealand share on the world stage. And we on these benches will continue to support the achievement of those goals. And I want to put on record too my desire to see a deepening of our trade links with our friends in Australia and New Zealand through trade agreements and indeed ever closer relationships on all levels. And I'm especially pleased to say that both countries, Madam Deputy Speaker, now have very fine Labour governments in office. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, these deals are signed. We're having the debate after they've been signed, but they now must be honoured and worked with for the benefit of people here and our friends in Australia and New Zealand. And specifically on the negotiations, I do want to say that the High Commissions of Australia and New Zealand have been remarkably helpful in briefing members across the House, briefing me as the Shadow Secretary of State, and I want to express my gratitude to them for all that they have done throughout the process. And also, to be clear, our debate today is not about our commitment on these benches to our deepening relationship with Australia and New Zealand. Rather, the question for this House today is about whether this Conservative government secured the best possible deals on behalf of our constituents or not. And let's be frank, the best possible deals were not achieved. The Australia deal is one-sided. Not my words, Madam Deputy Speaker, but they are the words of the current Prime Minister, who said that absolutely clearly over the summer. In fairness to the current Prime Minister, you can see why he takes that view. The impact assessment for the Australia deal shows a 94 million hit to our farming, forestry and fishing sectors and a 225 million hit to our semi-processed food industry. On the New Zealand deal, the government's own impact assessment states, and I quote, "Part of the gains result from a reallocation of resources away from agriculture, forestry and fishing, which will take a £48 million hit, and semi-processed foods will take a £97 million hit." Now, ministers know the serious concerns about the agriculture elements of these two agreements and the precedents they risk setting. We on these benches are very proud of our UK farmers and the standards of excellence that they seek to uphold. And we also believe the British produce can be a huge success in new markets, but we must also recognise the need for a level playing field for our farmers. Now, the government claims they're trying to mitigate the impact of the two deals, with tariff-free access being phased in. In the New Zealand deal, there are tariff rate quotas and product-specific safeguards for 15 years, and similarly in the Australia deal, the phasing in period on beef and sheep meat is of the same period, but the quotas the government has set for imports from Australia are far higher than the import level at the moment. And we just need to see what other countries achieved in trade deals with Australia. When Japan negotiated a trade deal with Australia, it limited the tariff-free increase in the first year to 10% on the previous year. South Korea achieved something similar in limiting the increases to 7%. Yet this government has negotiated a first-year tariff-free allowance with a 6,000% increase on the amount of beef that the UK currently imports from Australia. On sheep meat, it's a 67% increase. It's a quite simple question for the government, Madam Deputy Speaker. Why did they not achieve the same things that Japan and South Korea did? And why have our ministers failed to ensure that the Australian agricultural corporations are held to the same high standards as our farmers? And I see the Right Honourable Member for Camborne and Redruth, and it's good to see him in his place. But when he will recall, I'm sure, when he was the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, he said that he faced, and I quote, challenges in getting the former Prime Minister, I mean, it's quite confusing these days, the most recent former Prime Minister, an International Trade Secretary, to enshrine animal welfare in deals. And it's no wonder that the NFU said that it saw, and I quote, almost nothing in the deal that will prevent an increase in imports of food produced well below the production standards required of UK farmers. Perhaps it's no surprise that Australia's former negotiator at the WTO said, and I quote, I don't think we have ever done as well as this. And they are called trade negotiations for a reason. And it is a shame that this government failed to put forward the strongest possible case for the UK. And at the very least today, I say to ministers, please go away from here and work out what more you can do now to support our food producers in the face of these challenges. Of course, I'll give way.
I'm extremely grateful to him for giving way. And will he also agree that some farmers are very concerned about the procurement aspects of these deals, which will allow producers from Australia and New Zealand to compete for UK procurement deals, whilst UK producers are unable, likely due to the economies of scale challenges, to compete in Australia and New Zealand?
Yes, the Honourable Gentleman raises a very useful point, because what our farmers are seeking is a level playing field. We believe in our farmers. What we want them to be able to do is compete on the same basis. And when we're talking about a lack of success, we also see that in terms of tackling climate change in the Australian deal. The former COP26 President, the Right Honourable Member for Reading West, in this House on the 1st of December last year, said, and I quote, that the Australian deal would reaffirm both parties' commitments to upholding our obligations under the Paris Agreement, including limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. But the explicit commitment to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees was not in the deal, despite the fact that the Minister had said that only a matter of days before the deal was signed. What went wrong in those final days? Was it perhaps that ministers simply gave way for the sake of getting a completed deal? Now, as regards the current Secretary of State, I'm sad is not here today to open the debate. When she was standing to be Conservative Party leader, she branded the net zero climate target, and I quote, unilateral economic disarmament. So I think it's fair to say that there are worries about the commitment of the current Secretary of State to deliver the progress needed on climate change when that's the view she's expressed in public. It not only, Madam Deputy Speaker, misjudges the economic imperative of action to tackle climate change, but fails to recognise the huge opportunities the transition to net zero could provide. And I think the question also has to be asked, how broken can a party be when dabbling with climate change denial as a way to drum up support from its members? And on labour standards and workers' rights, the government did not push as hard as it might have done, as was brought up by my honourable friend, the member for Aberavon, in an earlier intervention. The TUC said in relation to the Australia deal that the agreement, and I quote, does not contain commitments to ILO core conventions, an obligation for both parties to ratify and respect those agreements, and that it provides a much weaker commitment to just the ILO declaration. And that is a mistake. We should not be setting a precedent of new trade agreements across the globe that sell short our workers here or elsewhere. Of course I'll give it.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? But surely, in the case of a deal with Australia, I accept his point in dealing with some countries. Here we not only have a strong Labour government committed to workers' rights and to trade union rights,
and a strong trade union movement. Aren't we slightly making a mountain out of a molehill here?
Not in relation to the government in Australia. I completely agree with my right honourable friend, and having met a number of representatives of the Australian government, I know their commitment to workers' rights is second to none. It's a shame we didn't see such a similar commitment from the party opposite, frankly. But of course, the issue with the Australia deal is the precedent it sets. And the issue is when other countries with lower workers' standards than Australia look at it, see the issue and think that's the starting point that they have in the negotiations. And a further issue is around geographical indicators. And again, I quote, just finish this point and I will come back to my right honourable friend. On geographical indicators, where the Cross-Party International Trade Committee said, and I quote, "The government has failed to secure any substantive concessions on the protection of UK geographical indicators in Australia. We have to ensure backing from fantastic national producers and not let them be undermined." And I'll come back to my...
Thank you for giving way, but isn't it also the case that this trade deal, for example, does not have an ISDS clause? Again, because of comparable legal systems and comparable levels of development, therefore it's not necessary. Surely we don't need one template for all sorts of trade deals with all sorts of countries in very different circumstances.
I completely agree with my right honourable friend that we don't need a single template, but I tell you what we could do with is a core trade policy and a core set of objectives from the government. And I want to turn, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may, to the issue of scrutiny, because for those in this House who follow trade matters closely, it won't have been without notice that this debate is a distinct change of focus from ministers at DIT. And ministers will, I'm sure, be aware, and I appreciate both ministers. I would say new. I think the Minister for Trade is competing with Frank Sinatra in the comeback stakes. But they will be aware of stinging rebukes from the Cross-Party International Trade Committee, who've regularly and strongly raised the need for better scrutiny structures around trade deals. And they called in their recent report for, and I quote, "the government to accept specific recommendations to enable better scrutiny of any FTAs." And it's very much cross-party. I mean, the member for Totnes has regularly made the case, both to me as the Shadow Secretary of State and indeed to the various Secretaries of State as well. And I do hope that those criticisms and recommendations are having an impact. I hope those recommendations that come from right across this House are being heard, and maybe that's why we have at least ended up with today's debate, though the irony is not lost. The parliamentary time has now been allocated to agreements that were long ago signed and agreed. I'll give way to my own friend.
I thank him. He's been very generous. On this point of scrutiny, he's a Welsh MP like me. Does he agree that the impact of these deals has a huge effect on, for example, the Welsh farming industry? So does he share my regret that the government hasn't published an impact assessment for the devolved nations, and has also ridden roughshod over any conventions around consulting properly with the devolved nations, whose governments are such important stakeholders in this process?
I entirely share my honourable friend's concern about the lack of specific impact assessment, but also share his disappointment. There isn't a specific set of structures in place where the devolved administrations can make their voices heard at a far earlier stage in the process, which I think would be extremely... of course I'll give...
I'm sorry, that is just not a complete representation of what actually goes on. The Ministerial Forum for Trade, which I set up, and I've actually yet, since returning to the department, yet chaired a meeting of it, but it will be meeting soon, allows all three devolved nations to meet with me to discuss forthcoming trade deals, forthcoming negotiations, and trade policy overall. That's exactly what it's in place for.
Well, firstly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to hear that from the Minister, because certainly the feedback I've had from the devolved administrations has not been positive with regard to the political interaction that they've had prior to trade deals being signed. But also, there is an issue as the extent of which the needs of the devolved administrations were taken into account. Now, he said that at the dispatch box to me. I hope he's as good as his word in terms of the trade deals negotiations that are ongoing, and the devolved administrations not only have the opportunity to have their say, but they're actually listened to as well.
Well, I'm looking forward to, in fact, I'm meeting Vaughan Gethin later this week, if I'm not mistaken. It might be next week, but in the coming days. And it's very important, Madam Deputy Speaker, to recognise that, of course, trade policy is a reserved matter, but it does have significant impact on areas of devolved competence, like, for example, agriculture. That is why it is quite right that the UK government carries out the negotiation, but does involve and does inform the devolved administrations. And that is exactly how it works with the Ministerial Forum for Trade and other interactions.
Well, I entirely agree it's the UK government carrying out the negotiations, but it's not to carry out the negotiations and inform the devolved administrations about it. It's to take their views into account before the negotiations begin, and indeed throughout it. And I hope the Minister will be as good as his word, and I'm sure we'll see that in the months to come.
Will he give way?
And, of course, I'll give way.
This is a very interesting and useful conversation, but is it not right that other countries do it very differently? Belgium includes their regions in the negotiating teams, and therefore they are in the room. USA includes representatives of trade unions and businesses in the negotiating teams, and they are therefore in the room. And Australia, in this particular instance, excludes any matters that the states are responsible for, so they are not touching them on this trade deal. Is it not the case that this government actually is the weaker of all the partners?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. There is a better way to be doing this, as he has just very eloquently set out. And indeed, to come on the theme of scrutiny, I mean, the government itself, Lord Grimston said in May 2020, the government does not envisage a new FTA proceeding to ratification without a debate first having taken place on it. Yet clearly that's not happened, which is why this debate today is in such odd circumstances. And there are crucial elements to both these deals that deserve wider debate and wider scrutiny. And I want to just highlight as well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the real challenge there was in the committee for the bill that the Minister has referred to, which was not a bill about giving effect to the whole range. It was a very specific narrow bill on the public procurement provisions. And what that meant is that, of course, under the rules of this House, entirely appropriate rules, Madam Deputy Speaker, no criticism of the rules, but the nature of the bill meant that finding areas of debate within Bill Committee was very, very difficult indeed, and it was prohibitively narrow. So climate change, workers' rights, this issue of consultation with devolved administrations, animal welfare, were not within the scope of the bill. The bills were already signed and agreed, as I've said, before they came before Parliament. So the scope for meaningful debate was fatally curtailed. There's been no scrutiny worthy of the name. And the International Trade Committee rightly criticised the process on the Australia deal and the government's premature triggering of the 21-day Constitutional Reform and Governance Act process without the full Select Committee consideration being available to members. And when pressed, the government refused to extend the process, all the while, whilst we saw it in a number of urgent questions, the then Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Lady for Berwick-upon-Tweed, swerved, I think it's, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think it's 8 invitations to attend the International Trade Select Committee. And I do wonder whether the reason for the reticence to open itself up to scrutiny is because ultimately the government knows it's falling short. I, of course, give way.
He is making an important point about scrutiny, and not one that I can escape now that I have to have some level of collective responsibility as a PPS, I hasten to add. But I actually think there is a wider conversation to be had, and I wonder whether or not he agrees about it, about the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, and about how it was introduced in 2010 under a Labour government, and whether or not actually a more effective system could be put in place, because it does seem we are out of kilter with our Commonwealth friends.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Totnes, who I think makes a perfectly reasonable point that we need to look at this whole scrutiny process to make it effective and indeed to update it so that it is fit for the current situation. Well, I've already indicated, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the current Prime Minister thinks the Australia deal is one-sided, but frankly that is just one of many criticisms that Conservative ministers and MPs have levelled at their own trade department and their own ministers. The member for Finchley and Golders Green, the former Minister for Exports, rightly said the trade access programme is underfunded. And he said of it, and I quote, "We support too few shows, we don't send enough business, our pavilions are often decent but overshadowed by bigger and better ones from our competitors." Now this could be due to the fact that the budget for our trade show access programme began falling sharply. And I looked, but well, to finish this point, and I'll come to the Honourable Gentleman. Now, I looked very carefully at when the trade show access programme started to be cut over the last 12 years, and I've got the figures here for every year it started to be cut. And it does seem that that happened in the middle of the last decade when a new Chief Secretary to the Treasury was appointed. And I really did wonder who that Chief Secretary of the Treasury was. And I wondered, because it's only been in post a short period on this particular occasion, but I've had a number of robust exchanges. We always enjoy them with the Honourable Member for Chelsea and Fulham. And this is not really a subject he's ever sought to debate me on before. So when I checked who was that new, confident, shining Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who actually started the cuts to the trade show access programme, it was none other than the right honourable gentleman, the member for Chelsea and Fulham, now the current Minister for Trade Policy. And the Ministers for Trade Policy have been having something of a checkered history under this government. I mean, we did just see the right honourable member for Portsmouth North in her new role, of course, as Leader of the House. She was criticised for her attentiveness and availability, not by me, not by any member of the opposition, but she was criticised for that by the Right Honourable Lady for Berwick-upon-Tweed, who said, and I quote, "There have been a number of times when she hasn't been available, which would have been useful, and other ministers have been left to pick up the pieces." Meanwhile, if you read the remarkable coverage of the most recent Prime Minister's tenure at the International Trade Department, it's amazing there was even limited progress, given the main aim appeared to have been securing photographs for Instagram. But I will say this for the former Prime Minister's time as Trade Secretary. Now, her request, as I understand it, when travelling in Australia, was for Sauvignon Blanc and fancy coffee. But it is as nothing. Compared to the Australian delicacies, I understand the member for West Suffolk has sampled when he's been out there. Now, of course, I think we'd all agree across this House that a trade deal offers our friends in Australia a fantastic array of British exports. But I do fear they may want to reconsider their options when the first expensive import that arrives is a tariff-free version of the member for West Suffolk. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll leave that there, aside from the passionate plea that I always make to people when there are important elections underway, like the Bush-Tucker trial. It's important to continue to make your voices heard, and I'm sure that people across the country, especially in West Suffolk, will be keen to continue exercising their vote on a daily basis. Madam Deputy Speaker, but the disorder and chaos that we've seen across government in recent months, and specifically the Department for International Trade, speaks of a government that lacks focus and direction. I speak to huge numbers of businesses every week, and they continually express how damaging this instability is. It has real consequences. It damages our exporting opportunities. That utter chaos of financial instability, tanking of the pound, damage to our country's standing are extraordinarily serious indeed. And this lack of clarity, this instability, is why you end up in a situation where promises are broken and vital progress slips. A trade deal with the US not delivered. A trade deal with India done by Diwali not delivered. 80% of UK free trade under FTAs by the end of 22 not delivered and won't be delivered. But it doesn't have to be this way. I will give it.
I think we may have been here before, and I apologise for perhaps reiterating what I've said before, but he keeps saying that we're not delivering and that we're taking too long or deals are being signed too quickly, and the Labour Party seems to be at odds with itself, because actually, whether it's our desire to join CPTPP, whether it's our desire to do trade deals with Japan, which we've achieved, whether it's Australia with the New Zealand, whether it's the UK to US state trade deal, these deals are being signed and we are actually joining new groups. It's not fair and it's not accurate to say that we're not actually delivering on the trade deals that we set out to achieve.
Well, what the honourable gentleman, I think, omits is the standard that I am judging the government against is their own manifesto from 2019, not some standard that I'm putting forward that's impossible for them to reach. And secondly, there's no inconsistency between being in favour of free trade deals but hoping that this government will actually negotiate decent ones at the negotiating table. I will have to finish in a moment, so I'll not take that intervention at the moment. What I would say to the government today, though, is that we are in a situation where the government's central trade strategy is one of a litany of broken promises. The two trade deals we have before us today are trade deals that have already been signed, sealed and delivered. Yet we are ending up today with a debate long afterwards in particularly strange circumstances. Access to British markets is not a bauble to be traded away easily, as this government is repeatedly doing. My message to them today is to stop selling the UK short. Come forward with a core trade strategy that will allow our world-leading businesses to thrive and deliver for communities across the country. Quite simply, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's time for a strong government with a sense of purpose, something the party opposite is in no position to provide.
George Eustace.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the current Secretary of State at DIT obviously had no role in these particular discussions, although my honourable friend did and will recall some of the discussions that took place. But the Secretary of State was not in the Cabinet at the time, nor in any of the Cabinet committees, and the Minister today has defended, obviously, the position that was taken at the time. My position is obviously slightly different. I was in the Cabinet in 2021, and I was in this Cabinet subcommittee that argued over the Australian trade deal. For yes, there were deep arguments and differences over how we should approach this. But since I now enjoy the freedom of the backbenches, I no longer have to put such a positive gloss on what was agreed. And I hope that my honourable friend will understand my reason for doing this. And that is that unless we recognise the failures that the Department for International Trade made during the Australia negotiations, we won't be able to learn the lessons of future negotiations. And there are critical negotiations underway right now, notably on CPTPP and on Canada, and it is essential that the Department for International Trade does not repeat the mistakes it made. And so the first step is to recognise that the Australia trade deal is not actually a very good deal for the UK. It wasn't for lack of trying on my part. Indeed, as my old friend pointed out, there were things that we achieved, a special agricultural safeguard for years 10 to 15, staged liberalisation across the first decade, the protection of British sovereignty in SPS issues. It's no surprise that many of these areas were areas negotiated either exclusively or predominantly by DEFRA on behalf of the UK team. But it has to be said that overall, the truth of the matter is that the UK gave away far too much for far too little in return. What would a good agreement have looked like? Well, it would have been having enduring TRQs on beef in particular, but probably also for sheep as well. The volumes probably would have started at around 10,000 tonnes per annum, rising after a decade to around 60,000, perhaps 80,000 tonnes. That's something that could have been manageable. We did not actually need to give Australia nor New Zealand full liberalisation in beef and sheep. It was not in our economic interest to do so, and neither Australia nor New Zealand had anything to offer in return for such a grand concession. And let us not forget as well that while we are about to open our market to unbridled access for Australian beef, Australia remains one of the few countries left in the world that maintains an absolute export ban for British beef. Not a single kilo of British beef is able to be sold in Australia since they maintain a protectionist ban using the BSE episode as a sham reason for doing so. Now, the impact of full liberalisation is hard to predict. And I think the reality is that provided we maintain a ban on hormones in beef, volumes may actually remain quite low. But here is the big challenge. The CPTP negotiation that is underway could mean accession and agreement to new dispute resolution processes that will undermine the UK's sovereignty in SPS issues and actually undermine our approach when it comes to banning hormones in beef. And if there were to be some foreign court or some foreign mediation process that said, as a matter of treaty, the UK had to accept beef from Australia treated with hormones, that could change the nature of this agreement considerably. Volumes could rise significantly, perhaps to over 200,000 tonnes over time, and that would have a very severe impact on British beef. Now, I would concede, I will give way.
Actually, I wonder if the Right Honourable Gentleman might be able to clarify this, because as I understand it, and I may be wrong on this, is that through CPTPP, the dispute mechanisms are done through the World Trade Organization. And I'm not sure that the World Trade Organization, as it currently stands, would be able to override any one of our SPS standards.
The CPTPP has provisions for its own dispute resolution. They are modelled on what happens in the WTO. But here is the thing. If we don't get the negotiation right with CPTPP, it may well undermine our ability to practice our own SPS regime and have our own independence in this area. Now, if we were to have a significant increase in Australian beef because we'd been forced by a court or a dispute resolution service to allow hormones in beef, and there have been close challenges in the past done through the WTO, then that would be intolerable, I think, for any British government. So much so that a government of the day would probably have to trigger Article 32.8 of the agreement and give 6-month notice to terminate the FTA. And it's worth remembering that, in my view, the best clause in this treaty that we have with Australia is the final clause, because it does give any UK government, present or future, an unbridled right to terminate and renegotiate the FTA at any time with just 6 months' notice. Now, many members in this House will remember that we had hours of fun in the last Parliament discussing triggering Article 50. I suspect we would prefer not to have to go back to that, but it is the ultimate and final sanction, which, as things have turned out, is quite a critical safeguard given the size of the concessions that were made to Australia in that trade deal. So what are the lessons that we should learn? The first, and I think most important, is that we should not set arbitrary timescales for concluding negotiations. The UK went into this negotiation holding the strongest hand, holding all of the best cards. But at some point in early summer 2021, the then Trade Secretary took a decision to set an arbitrary target to conclude heads of terms by the time of the G7 summit. And from that moment, the UK was on the back foot repeatedly. In fact, at one point, the then Trade Secretary asked her opposite number from Australia what he would need in order to be able to conclude an agreement by G7. And of course, the Australian negotiator very kindly set out the Australian terms, which then shaped eventually the deal. Now, we must never repeat that mistake. And the Minister and the Secretary of State, I know, right now, will be getting submissions from officials saying that we need to join CPTPP in a hurry, that if we don't do it now, then we won't join the club early enough, we won't be shaping the rules, we might miss the boat, it's a crucial part of the Pacific tilt and so on. But actually, the best thing that the Minister can do is to go back and tell Crawford Faulkner that I don't care if it takes a decade to do this agreement, we will get the right agreement. We're not ever again going to put ourselves in such a position as setting the clock against us and shattering our own negotiating position. The second lesson is that we need to look, in my view, Madam Deputy Speaker, at a machinery of government change. And I believe that all responsibility for agri-food negotiations, including relating to TRQs, should be transferred from the Department for International Trade to DEFRA, because DEFRA has superior technical knowledge in this area. It's important to remember that DEFRA never actually left the world stage. The Department for International Trade is a new creation, with people often lacking experience but doing their best to pick things up. Even during the EU era, DEFRA maintained a presence in trade negotiations, advising and informing the EU's position and dealing with matters such as market access around the globe. So DEFRA is worldly and it has deep technical knowledge in this area, and I believe that DEFRA should take full responsibility for negotiating TRQs in agri-food. The third change that I think we need to look at is strengthening the role of Parliament in scrutinising and perhaps even agreeing the negotiating mandate. Countries such as Japan, the United States and the EU all use their parliamentary processes to their advantage. I remember when we were negotiating with Japan and seeking to increase access for British cheese to Japan, Japan said, well, we would love to, but unfortunately we can't because there's a parliamentary motion that we cannot breach, and therefore we cannot retreat on this position. The UK doesn't have that at the moment. We could use Parliament and use a mandate agreed by Parliament to say to trading partners, we're not able to agree what you're asking for. But if they perceive that Crawford Faulkner calls the shots and that he will always go through some back channel to get something agreed, well then you're not actually going to be in a very strong position. You undermine your negotiating position. Which brings me, Madam Deputy Speaker, to my final point. And look, I've always been a huge fan of the British Civil Service. I've never been a minister or a politician to level criticism at them. I've enjoyed 9 years of incredibly good relations with civil servants at all levels. But I do want to raise a comment about personnel within the Department for International Trade, because Crawford Faulkner, who is currently the interim permanent secretary, is not fit for that position in my experience. His approach always was to internalise Australian demands, often when they were against UK interests. His advice was invariably to retreat and make fresh concessions, and all the while he resented people who understood technical issues greater than he did. And it was perhaps something of a surprise when he arrived from New Zealand to find that actually there were probably several hundred civil servants within the UK civil service who did indeed understand trade better than he did, and he's not been very good over the years at listening to them. He's now done that job for several years. I think it would be a good opportunity for him to move on and to get a different type of negotiator in place, somebody who understands British interests better than I think he's been able to.
SNP spokesperson Drew Hendry.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I extend my birthday wishes to the Minister too, although I won't ask him how many candles are on his cake, but I'm afraid I cannot hold a candle for the defence he's given for these deals. And you know, it seems that I'm not alone. The Right Honourable Member for Camborne and Redruth has just been on his feet. There seem to be many more Tory critics. I'm going to refer to a few of them in my remarks. Firstly, Madam Deputy Speaker, a general debate is no replacement for genuine parliamentary scrutiny. This government have failed to provide that, even though it was promised. These deals lumped together in this debate are one-sided. A betrayal of farmers that threaten food security, animal welfare, reduce consumer confidence, find climate change expendable and do nothing to mitigate the enormous losses of Brexit, and are quite possibly breaking international law. Yet again, they provide no reason to support this further exercise in UK self-harm, and simply double underscore the increasing risks of the UK and the need for Scotland to become a normal, independent country and to rejoin the world's most successful trading bloc, the EU. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me cover these points in order. I'll make some progress now, give way. Let me cover these points in an order and in more detail. When I say these are one-sided deals, as we've heard, I am in fact quoting the current Prime Minister, and he was right. Of course, he was also, given his party is in power, being generous. These are awful deals. They are unmitigated disasters, and that is why they are refusing to allow Parliament to vote on them. These deals are the legacy of the previous Prime Minister and make as much sense as the infamous mini-budget. I'll give way.
He's making this point about whether or not we can vote on them, but the reality is this is why CRAG doesn't work, because having a vote on it wouldn't change anything, and he full well knows this. We're leading people down a path that doesn't actually clarify the fact that under CRAG, the votes in that mechanism do not make any change to the trade deals that we're talking about.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I admire the right honourable member for his dexterity. Having been in the House when he has quite rightly criticised the lack of scrutiny from the government on this front bench, I understand he is now in the employ of the government benches and must sing a different tune. The fact of the matter is that this is not good enough. Of course, no, I'm going to make some progress. Of course, the Prime Minister was also given his party was in power, as I said, being generous. These are awful deals. They're unmitigated disasters. And as I say, that's why Parliament isn't getting the chance to scrutinise these properly. To the sectors concerned, they will do similar harm as the mini-budget. The current Prime Minister has also said that the, quote, shouldn't be rushing to sign trade deals as quickly as possible. We agree, but wait a minute. He's the Prime Minister. Why is he then allowing this to proceed? If he doesn't agree, is letting this go through just another part of a grubby deal for power? It makes no sense otherwise. They're keen enough to tear up deals like the Northern Ireland Protocol, yet won't get back around the negotiating table on these, even though they can. These deals are bad, very bad for our farmers and food producers. The National Farmers Union President, Minette Batter, says of the Australia deal, this is a one-sided deal. When it comes to agriculture, the Australians have achieved all that they asked for, and British farmers are left wondering what has been secured for them. And well might they wonder, Madam Deputy Speaker. She went on to say of the New Zealand deal, the government is now asking farmers to go toe-to-toe with some of the most export-oriented farmers in the world, without the serious long-term and properly funded investment in UK agriculture that can enable us to do so. The sort of strategic investment in farming and exports that the New Zealand government has made in recent decades. This has a knock-on effect, Madam Deputy Speaker, on food security. These deals are bad policy at the worst possible time. The laissez-faire, couldn't care, get it over the line Brexiteer ideology that has deprioritised domestic food production in support of importing cheaper, for now, lower standard food is dangerous and should be put on hold immediately. It sets a thumpingly bad precedent. The rest of the world is watching, and they want the same one-sided access that has been squandered here. If he wants to pick up this point, I'll give...
Well, I will on the point of food security, because this is exactly why this government passed in its Agricultural Act the need to actually report back on food security so we could review and ensure that this country has a full and complete level of food security after that report. Does he not agree that actually this is us taking it seriously rather than ignoring it?
Madam Deputy Speaker, it will come as no surprise that I do not agree with the honourable member opposite. These are damaging deals. They're one-sided, and other people will want access. Talks are ongoing with India, Brazil, Mexico, the Gulf states, the CPTPP countries, and Canada. Will they now accept less than has been offered here? This might just be the damaging start of the process. No wonder the National Audit Office report says the UK Trade Department is taking risks in its haste to sign new deals. And this is bad for consumers. Research by Which found that 72% of people across the nations of the UK do not want food coming in through these trade deals that does not meet current standards. And boy, the standards differ. In Australia, animal welfare standards are well below what is expected of our producers, particularly on pigs, eggs, sheep and beef. Cramped sow stalls, battery cages, the painful mulesing of sheep, huge herds of cattle in zero grazing feedlots, and twice the permissible transport times for live animals that we have here. Australian poultry farmers use 16 times, Madam Deputy Speaker, more antibiotics per animal than our farmers. The UK government's own advisers have stated that there is concern about the overuse of pesticides in Australia for UK farmers. 144 highly hazardous pesticides. Perhaps none of this should come... I will give it.
Don't we also import, for example, chicken from countries where there may be some very questionable standards. For example, from Brazil, where we also import beef from, and also from Thailand and others. And aren't there actually, even within the EU framework, considerable variations in animal welfare standards across the EU?
If there are variations in standards, there's certainly nothing like this. As I've just said, the line that you intervened, the honourable member intervened on was 144 highly hazardous pesticides. Now, perhaps none of this should come as a surprise, given that the former Prime Minister who brokered the deal employed the former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, as a trade advisor. Incidentally, I don't think, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Australians will return the favour. Abbott is a notorious climate sceptic. That is why this deal gets worse and worse, leaving aside all the obvious food miles that are involved in all the imports. He is on record as saying, when he was Australian Prime Minister, that his main role in trade talks was to ensure his negotiators, and I quote, weren't sidetracked by peripheral issues such as environmental standards. It looks like he succeeded on both sides of the world, Madam Deputy Speaker. Little surprise with this fracking government, whose Prime Minister had to be shamed into attending COP27. Australian oil and gas production is set to increase substantially until at least 2030, with dozens and dozens of new coal mines, and yet there is nothing on the UK government's agenda on this. No wonder even Tory Lord Deben, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, condemned the Australia deal as totally offensive. The Scottish Government called on the UK Government to prioritise the Paris Agreement commitments, but the UK Government signed this deal with nout. Indeed, we now know they actively scrubbed all of these concerns in haste to get this deal signed, as departmental emails prove. There are no legally binding, enforceable climate change conditions in either deal. No wonder, as I said earlier, they don't want these deals to be scrutinised. They may, however, Madam Deputy Speaker, have broken international law through that very lack of scrutiny. They'll probably just shrug their shoulders, of course, like their Prime Minister and former Prime Minister, because they're getting pretty good at law-breaking at that side of the House. A formal complaint will, however, be heard by the Our House Convention Compliance Committee. These tragic comic deals are put into even sharper focus, however, for this Brexit and bust Britain, as the EU have just signed their own deal with New Zealand. And yes, you guessed it, Madam Deputy Speaker, on better terms than the UK, with actual farming safeguards. In the first year of the agreement, the UK allows 12,000 tonnes of New Zealand beef into the UK. The 27 EU countries, only 333,000 tonnes between all of them. By year 15, the UK a whopping 60,000 tonnes, while the EU will have capped imports at 10,000 and still apply a 7.5% tariff. The EU have secured a better deal on beef, sheep, cheese, butter and more. And look at what we've lost through Brexit. In the EU, we used to have around half our trade paperwork free. Now, 100% of our trade is bundled up in red tape. For every £490 of damage from the loss of EU trade, these deals combined will at best realise £3. Scotland's food industries are painfully punished for something Scotland voted against. Fruit and vegetable exports to the EU are down by more than half, dairy and eggs down by a quarter. Brexit is a disastrous economic hit that Scotland should not be forced to endure. On the deals debated today and on those planned, we call on the Department of Trade to publish an impact assessment of proposed free trade deals with Australia, New Zealand, the CPTPP, India and Canada, with particular focus on food and farming, showing the anticipated effects in all four nations. The UK government must stop gambling with Scottish farming, food production, manufacturing and trade. They've failed to protect our brands. It has gambled with food standards, with workers' rights and protections. It's reckless over the environment and climate change, and has been with so obvious note turbocharging inflation and threatening people's well-being, as well as diminishing their household budgets. And yet, Madam Deputy Speaker, they have the brass neck, the utter cheek to say that we should have supported this place so often in a race to the bottom, especially in this international lunacy and trading failure. People in Scotland can see the risk of not being a normal independent country, but remaining shackled to Westminster. They see these one-sided deals do nothing for our farmers, damage our food security, lower standards, fail on animal welfare and climate change, possibly break international law, and do nothing to mitigate the eye-watering costs of Brexit. They cannot be supported, and it is clearer than ever that Scotland must return to the EU as an equal and normal independent country to escape Westminster's basket case ideologies.
Sir Paul Beresford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. That was really disappointing. The speech from the member for Inverness. I was interested in the speech from the member for Camborne, who's obviously deeply into it, much more than I am and can't be. I want to thank the Minister for his quick and enthusiastic cruise through. It's a birthday present for us as well. Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK trade with New Zealand in particular is really long-standing. It took off with the first refrigerated shipment of meat in a boat called the Dunedin, and I hope the Scots with us will notice that. It set sail loaded with meat, sheep, in 1882. There's a sad note to this though, because the boat itself, with all crew, disappeared at sea in 1890. Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't have the knowledge of some of the people speaking today, but I've got a personal interest, which the accent shows. I'm a holder of both countries' passports. By that I mean New Zealand and this country. And many people think from my accent that I'm Australian, so I guess I can add that in as well. New Zealand and Australia, then and now, are huge agricultural producers with a huge market of lamb, milk and product to the UK, particularly in those times. Now, it's very much broader spread, and in fact, many of the farmers in New Zealand, and I've just been there, are looking towards this country to help them to fill their portfolio with the EU. So I don't have the fear. Before the UK entered the then common market, Australia and New Zealand provided a huge trade, particularly in lamb and milk products, to the UK. Anchor butter being one of my favourite butters. In return, the UK was selling manufactured products to New Zealand and Australia. British manufacturing, particularly of cars and household goods, dominated. This was the norm. To me, I see this particular deal and the opportunity as a return to the norm. One would expect it, and it has been mentioned, kith and kin links and the support of both those Commonwealth nations of the UK in the last two world wars actually support and make us understand why Australia and New Zealand are sympathetic to us. The loss and the diminution of the UK market when we went into the common market was sorely felt. They didn't like it, they were aggrieved. However, when that caused a reduction in the trade of both countries, they didn't just sit on their hands, they got out and got other deals. Over 100 nations are now on their trading list. As a result, they are key members of the TPP, which has been mentioned several times, and that could be important to us because we've got the link and might get us in on this partnership. This new agreement will give access to the Antipodean markets for UK manufacturing, for tech services and companies. It will also, and very importantly, open access for UK professionals to live and work in Australia and New Zealand. Equally, it will open the door for Australasian professionals, medicals, dentals, accountants, should I suggest rugby coaches for Wales and Scotland perhaps? I thought I might get a bite. My farmers, my Mole Valley farmers, were deeply concerned that the opening the doors to the tariff-free imports would swamp the UK agricultural sector. This was particularly so for dairy products, as well to some degree of sheep and beef meats. Fortunately, this agreement, as the Minister's pointed out, with a staggered phasing of tariff reductions, is particularly welcome. But again, having just been there, in New Zealand at least, it's quite apparent that they will want the support of our products, as I've already mentioned, for them to fill their quotas in the EU. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK needs to push its goods in these two countries. For example, the New Zealand and Australian roads are currently dominated by Asian manufactured vehicles. And I've asked people there, why are you not buying British? The answer is we will when the prices come down, when the tariffs come down. With this tariff reduction, we've got a chance to take our share and more. But we've got to use it. We've got to get out there and we've got to push our products in those two countries. I'm willing to offer my services as a translator because their English is not. It's even as a trade envoy. But the opportunity is there, but we have to get out and get it. Thank you.
John Speller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And trade is one of the issues that from time to time erupts in British politics and indeed has in some areas dominated political discussion and has twice split, torn apart the Conservative Party. After all, that's why we had free trade halls in many of the great cities of the industrial North and Midlands. And there is a very strong case to be made for open trade. And I have to say, sometimes I wish that the government would make it more strongly, both in general and also in detail. And particularly the opportunities that are presented. We've heard a lot about some of the possible problems, I'll come on to those, but the opportunities that there are for our industries and services, mentioned just now by the honourable member. Because we have to recognise, and we should be making the argument, that trade has been a major engine of human progress for millennia and has driven prosperity, innovation and a flow of ideas. It's enabled the development of civilization. And those who sometimes are making arguments against trade, one almost wonders whether they think the Industrial Revolution was desirable, whether they thought that was right, whether it has been a great advance in human progress, even though there were considerable costs, well documented costs to that development. Fundamentally, humanity benefited and moved forward. And we need to be making those arguments, and not those who want to go back to some idealistic pastoral age. It was never never much of an idyll at all, but certainly we have made great progress as a result. And if we're going to do that, then we have to say that who better to do such deals with than Australia and New Zealand, countries with whom we share huge affinities of families and relatives, with whom we have shared defence and security and intelligence relationships over several centuries, countries who have similar legal systems, and who also have similar values and work together in the wider world. There may be some difficulties, and I'm very pleased to, or not pleased, I'm slightly dismayed, but also I suppose I could take some partisan pleasure in the revelations of the utter inadequacies of at least one of the ministers involved in the trade deals, who made the fundamental error in negotiations, any negotiations, of believing that getting a deal is more important than the contents of the deal. That's a recipe for failure in business, and it's a recipe for failure in government as well. And I hope, therefore, that ministers now may learn the lessons from that period of actually where it wasn't even the deal, it was the photo opportunity for the deal that seems to have been more important. We definitely need to move beyond that, of course.
For giving way. Does he think it also perhaps reflects the fact that
For many years, the UK has not needed negotiating teams and have not been going into those negotiating rooms on behalf of the UK and for trade deals. And perhaps their naivety is what, in part, along with ministers' over-enthusiasm, has resulted in poor terms in this trade deal.
I do take the honourable lady's point about the shortfall in technical skills, and the previous speaker identified certain failings in at least one individual. I'm not qualified to comment on that, but I'm perfectly prepared to believe it. There was certainly, because trade deals have been undertaken by the European Commission on behalf of all the countries, there was certainly a technical deficit. But that was exaggerated and indeed made far worse because of the obsessive and indeed utterly irresponsible attitude of the Trade Secretary at the time. Unfortunately, the Conservative Party then thought fit to then put that same individual as Prime Minister, where those same negative qualities completely imploded their government and demonstrated the description of her as the human hand grenade was so aptly made. There was a discussion earlier, I've mentioned about several of the common factors between our countries, and that was one on labour standards. And I think it's enormously encouraging, the developments in Australia, where some of those reductions in labour standards that were brought in by the previous Conservative government there are now being rolled back, and also trade unionism encouraged. And I'm sorry that the trade minister has just moved away, because when he was replying about the talks with the United States, I thought he missed an opportunity to say that at those talks in the United States, both in Baltimore and in Scotland, that in fact the trade union movements of both the UK and the US were involved. Now, I know that that was at the insistence of President Biden and the American trade team, but I would have hoped that they would have learnt the positive advantages of having the trade union movement involved in those discussions, and that they would actually, with countries that have comparable, effective free trade unions, they would be helping to include those in future discussions, because it adds an enormous value in getting the right sort of deal. But the fact that we need, that we need trade deals, we need to have trade, and also that Australia and New Zealand would be excellent partners in this, does not exonerate the government from their inadequate performance, which has been described on several previous debates, and indeed again here today. And it's also not just about getting the deals, and it's also about actually enforcing them. And another area where the government have failed considerably, and other governments as well, for example, is in allowing China into the World Trade Organization with the various qualifications that requires, and then allowing them time and time again to actually breach the conditions which they joined up to, until they're in a position where it becomes much more difficult to take action, because they have grown their economy quite often by violating those deals, as well as by industrial espionage in order to steal intellectual property. If I can then just touch on scrutiny. Again, I slightly fail to understand the government's reluctance to face scrutiny on this. They've got a big majority. The farming influence is not so dominant on their backbenches. On some of these deals, they've actually got a case to make. And I do not understand, given that we're not actually overburdened with parliamentary business coming down from the government, because they don't seem to have got their act together, but I do not understand why now we're having these debates, but why they didn't have them at an earlier stage in order to defend their position. And, for example, to talk about some of the other benefits of the deal. Been mentioned again in the debates about visas for professionally qualified people. I said in a previous debate, surely we also ought to be looking at where there is enough commonality in the training, and so we should therefore take on the professional bodies and say, what additional training does an individual need? They don't need to fully re-qualify. They need actually to undertake any necessary training to deal with differences, to encourage the movement backwards and forwards of professionally qualified people, and also, of course, to encourage training in all of our countries. So, I fully accept that the ministers have a difficult task in remedying some of the deficiencies from the Truss era. But I would hope that they would learn the lessons from these agreements and would actually take those forward in future discussions in order to ensure both in process terms that they improve it, but also then in terms of substance as well, and focus on deals. Notwithstanding that, I think we should also, on both sides of the House, and I think the position of our new front bench in trade, again, as I said back in September, is a great improvement on some of our previous trade teams for the opposition in their position of actually having a generally favourable view of trade, but a critical view of the detail. I would hope that we can then go forward, and not just bluntly for some of those in this chamber whose only answer is to go back to the EU, which indeed had many of the problems that are associated with some of the trade deals that we're looking for. Trade deals are not easy, whoever one is doing it with. Can we just dump the ideology a bit, focus on the practicality for the benefit of our people, and particularly not just of our rural areas, very important though they are, but also of those who live in our great towns and cities across the country.
T. Magnell.
Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to follow the right honourable gentleman from Worley. I did battle against him in 2017 and he sent me running, but I'm pleased to be able to be in the chamber with him and to be discussing something where we are of one heart and one mind. I should also start, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that I'm partly here as a member of the Trade Committee because our chair of the Trade Committee appears to have thrown his toys out of the pram and doesn't want to come and debate the very thing that he's been asking about for the last 18 months. But of course the Trade Committee has done a huge amount of work over the 2.5 years that I've been sitting on it. We've produced reports on scrutiny, we've produced reports on the New Zealand Agreement, the Australia Agreement, on UK export finance, on inward foreign direct investment, on digital trade and data. And the very reason for these reports is because we are signing trade deals at a rapid rate of knots. Not too fast as the opposition might paint the picture, but actually in steady progress, signing deals that will be of huge benefit to the UK service economy, to our producers, to the British consumers, to the British public. And we should and ought to talk more about that. We are attempting on the Trade Committee to keep up with the government's ambitious programme to ensure that we are able to produce reports for this House. I have to say, every point that the Honourable Gentleman from Worley said, Right Honourable Gentleman said from Worley on scrutiny, I agree with. I do think we have to have a conversation in this chamber about scrutiny. It's not to be feared, and if anything, the expertise in this House would be a huge benefit for both members of the government and for those members of the International Trade Department to listen to. The whole point of the work that we perform on the Trade Committee has to be as a critical friend, Madam Deputy Speaker, to look at what works, to look at what doesn't work, and to try and strengthen the government's position through those reports, through those engagement sessions, and by consulting widely with experts across the United Kingdom. We all wish to see the United Kingdom to strike the most effective trade deals, although that might not be the case in relation to the SNP, who don't seem to support any trade deals at any point in any time. And in fact, I was accused of being quite having some ample dexterity in being able to say that I want to see scrutiny. But actually, the Honourable Gentleman has gone, who's now no longer sitting in his place, started his debate by saying that he was pro-free trade. I've never heard the SNP sort of give us such a line before, because it's clearly not the case. And while we're at it, when they do start on this line of saying that they want to be part of the EU, leaving the Union of the United Kingdom is the only thing that will cause an economic catastrophe for Scotland. But, as I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the opportunity opportunity in this day's debate to be able to talk about the Australia and New Zealand trade deal. Because so often is the case in this country, we talk about the import impact rather than the export opportunities. And I believe there are many, and we must talk them up. It's no wonder when we listen to the opposition, when they highlight Australian members of parliament and ministers saluting these trade deals, that we get the end of the stick, that they suggest that they've only got the best side of this deal. Well, if they started promoting the positive elements in this trade agreement, we might also find that people would actually have a little bit of faith in it, because scratch the surface and you will find that there are huge, huge benefits. But if I may, I just want to start on 5 recommendations that came from one of the most recent reports of our committee. Firstly, and I asked it to the opposition shadow spokesperson about the role of CRAG. This was introduced by the Labour government at the time in 2010. We do need to have an open and frank discussion across party, across the House, about what new system we might be able to put in place. If we're not going to use it, if we're not going to use the mechanism that has been promised before, then we might as well look at some alternative measure. And if we are going to ignore having a votable motion, could we at least, and I ask the government with the greatest respect to this, could we please have general debates during the CRAG process, so at least we can talk about it while and before the deal has actually been ratified. I think that does send a positive message to all of us who return to our constituencies to talk to farmers who are concerned, to businesses who might be concerned. That at least would be a simple thing to put forward. The second is that we must also ensure that the scrutiny and the ministers are turning up on time to the Trade Committee, which we have had problems with in the past. But I have to say, as has been said already, the front bench team that we have in the Department of Trade is truly excellent. I've worked with a number of them on a number of occasions, and it is very reassuring to know that they take these points seriously, and I've had those conversations with them both in public and in private. But I'd also like to just say there is a valid point in ensuring that government departments are joined up when it comes to trade deals. That wasn't always the case, and it certainly wasn't felt so from the committee's point of view during the Australia negotiations, better though it was on the New Zealand negotiations. And the last thing is that this point about a joined up negotiating objective that we have as a one-size-fits-all, I'm less than persuaded by. I think we have to be flexible about looking about the needs of each and every trade deal that we end up signing. Now, in relation to the Australia trade agreement, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to look at where it benefits us. And I think the first thing, as it was said by the Minister who's no longer in his place, is that 82% of our workforce and 80% of GDP are in financial services. And this is really where this deal strikes, and strikes incredibly well and effectively. As for the first time, we will have greater access, more than ever before, in Australian markets. From architecture to law to financial services, we will be on an equal footing. And as a result of this, this could increase UK service exports to Australia by £5 billion. Additionally, it cuts the bureaucracy that so many small businesses have been frustrated about on at the same time. The second point I want to make around this deal is around mobility, which does offer the opportunity to support economic growth, recovery, and the opportunities for people on both sides in Australia and in the United Kingdom. Under the new travel arrangements, which are based on reciprocity, it's worth noting that there'll be a youth mobility scheme, innovation and early careers scheme, exchange pilot, there will be a working holiday maker initiative, and the whole purpose of this, again going back to what the Right Honourable Gentleman said from Worley, is that there will also be side initiatives for us to be able to look at how we can expand this. Trade deals, once signed, are not static. They evolve over time, and we must remind ourselves that what was signed recently does not necessarily have to be the trade deal that we live with for the rest of our lives. We can steadily improve them, and we must look to do so. And certainly when it comes to visa arrangement for shared professional qualifications, we should absolutely be heading in that direction. Yes, of course I will.
Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Does the Honourable Gentleman seriously think that that is in any way compensation for the loss of freedom of movement and the workers that we were getting through from Europe as a result of the disastrous Brexit deal?
Well, firstly, we have a trade and cooperation agreement, a free trade agreement with the European Union, which is important to note. We are also, which you voted against, which we also have a significant amount of opportunity to welcome people. The whole point is about control over it. The whole point on this is about having control. I think it's absolutely right that if we are going to sign new relationships with countries around the world, then we want to be able to do it through the Commonwealth, through countries that have shared ideas and views about the world, and I think we should welcome that. There was a point
made by a member from Wales, whose constituency I can't remember off the top of my head, but he made this point about our inability to bid in on Australian government contracts. Well, actually, I'm afraid to say that's incorrect. Within the very terms of the Australian trade agreement, businesses in the United Kingdom will be able to bid into Australian government contracts worth up to £10 billion a year. This is the most extensive the Australians have ever agreed to in any free trade agreement in the world. And then lastly, on the point around farming, I absolutely bowed to the knowledge and experience of the former Secretary of State for DEFRA, but I was surprised that we didn't have more about the Agriculture Commission that we set up, the Trade and Agriculture Commission. And I do hope that that might be the vehicle in which we can ensure better scrutiny, better enhancements and support around farming in the future. And I do think we need to look at that, and we've certainly had extensive negotiations in the Trade Committee about how we can use that. And maybe that is, of course, yes, of course I will.
Does he agree that if you were to try to strengthen the Trade and Agriculture Commission, the right thing to do would be to move it within DEFRA and to remove it away from the Department of